Test, test, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, testing, testing. Test, test for the court reporter, 1, 2, 3, test, test for the court reporter, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. Today, we come together to discuss the intelligence community's 2024 annual threat assessment. We begin with an open session that is being broadcast live and streamed on the committee's YouTube channel. The open session is entirely unclassified. All participants are reminded to refrain from discussing classified information or other information protected from public disclosure. Upon the conclusion of the open session, we will recess and resume for the closed session in the committee hearing room at 2 p.m. or immediately following the first vote series, currently scheduled from 1:30 to 2:10. It is the intention of the committee to proceed with this hearing without any disruptions. Any disruption of the committee will result in the United States Capitol Police restoring order, and the protesters will be removed and arrested. It is my pleasure to welcome a renowned group of intelligence community leaders. During today's proceedings, we will hear from the Honorable Avril Haines, Director of National Intelligence, the Honorable William Burns, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Honorable Christopher Wray, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, General Timothy Haugh, Director of the National Security Agent and Commander of the U.S. Cyber Command, and Lieutenant General Jeffrey Kruse, Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I want to pause for just a minute to give my personal thanks to Director Burns and to Director Haines in the manner in which you've worked with this committee over the past over a year now in both a bipartisan way, working with Jim Haines, myself, and all of our members, making certain that we have the information that we need and being available for discussions on important issues. I greatly appreciate your contributions to the success of this committee, and I wanted to recognize that. The annual threat assessment hearing provides the intelligence community an opportunity to update Congress and the American people on serious threats to our national security. The intelligence community exists to protect the American people by informing policy and decision makers of the threats posed to national security, which includes critical infrastructure, economic security, cybersecurity, food security, and several other components of national security. Each year, the world evolves, growing more interdependent. Our adversaries are aligning, and emerging technologies are changing the operational environment. We are in the midst of a shifting geopolitical landscape with strategic competition at the forefront. Now more than at any other time, at least not since the Cold War, nation-state threats are dominating the United States' national security concerns. Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran are anti-American and working together domestically, regionally, and internationally. These common adversaries have overlapping interests and approaches. Example includes Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Hamas's attack on Israel, and continued Iranian proxy assaults in the region, and the People's Republic of China's regular military show of force threatening Taiwan. Also concerning is Pyongyang's recent tests of the North Korean intercontinental ballistic missile Hwasong. Based on the missile's flight data, South Korea and Japanese assets are at risk, and it has the potential range of striking the United States. This is a flagrant violation of United Nations Security Council resolutions. Over the last year, the committee has conducted numerous engagements, both in and beyond the SCIF. One area that seems fragmented and vague is the foreign-domestic divide. There are heightened threats at the border, and the homeland is under constant assault, whether it be from cyber attacks, counterintelligence threats, or foreign malign influence. What is not clear is how the intelligence community communicates those threats to other federal, state, local, tribal, or private sector partners. The lack of clarity on this issue raises the question of whether the federal government is organized appropriately and prepared to defend the United States against the kinds of threats the American people face from our foreign adversaries here. On more than one occasion, some of you have publicly warned of threats to homeland security from the People's Republic of China. The PRC is compromising and maintaining persistent access to U.S. critical infrastructure. As stated in an unclassified cybersecurity advisory published to the public last month, the PRC is targeting and has already compromised telecommunications, energy, transportation, and water sectors. To quote this advisory, in some cases, the cyber actors have been living inside information technology networks for years to pre-position for disruptive or destructive cyber attacks in the event of a major crisis or conflict with the United States. Remember, the advisory states that this actively has been going on for years. And that really is, I think, the threat that we need to rise to, is an understanding that this is not a new phenomenon of the PRC targeting assets and infrastructure of the United States. In addition to pre-positioning in critical infrastructure, China seeks to be a world power in science and technology by any means possible. This poses a significant counterintelligence threat to the United States and allied partners. China is attempting to advance as a technology superpower by offering investment and acquiring or stealing intellectual property in fields like power and energy, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, agriculture, quantum computing, and semiconductors. Russia continues an unjust war against Ukraine's sovereignty, bolstering its defense production by leveraging relationships with China and Iran. We should not forget that North Korean munitions factories are supplying Russia with weapons and artillery shells to use against Ukraine. We look forward to further insights on Russia's nuclear posture, directed energy weapons, anti-satellite capabilities in space, and ground-based anti-satellite missiles designed to target U.S. and allied satellites. Iran, who is also benefiting from closer ties with China and Russia, has built and funded a network of proxies to promote Iran's regional objectives. Iran supported Hamas's attack on Israel and continues to back Hamas. Iran provides weapons and intelligence for terrorist attacks on U.S. personnel, installations in the region, and terrorist attacks on the global supply chain transiting the Red Sea. Last year, during the annual threat assessment hearing, I set forth the committee's plan for the reauthorization of FISA, Section 702. An immense amount of committee work has gone into our bill reforming FISA. We produced a strong bill that puts in place the appropriate compliance guardrails and provides the tools necessary to protect our country. We know the importance of this authority, and we know the danger to America and our allies if the intelligence community does not have the capability to produce intelligence from FISA 702 collection. There is a perceived lack of accountability that is the most troubling aspect for Congress and the American public to trust the intelligence community, and that the intelligence community is doing the right thing, reporting wrongdoing, taking responsibility, correcting actions, and monitoring actions. That is why our FISA bill aggressively reforms the FISA process to address past abuses. In the face of all these challenges, the intelligence community's core mission stands, which is to identify foreign threats and provide warning to protect Americans. Our committee oversight work takes this very seriously, and we continually examine areas for improvement and provide bipartisan legislative solutions when needed. Today, you will hear questions from our members on various interest areas, and to be respectful of everyone's time, I ask that all of you be direct and succinct. With that, I look forward to hearing the answers from our esteemed panel, and I recognize my ranking member, Jim Haines, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our distinguished panel, and in particular, General Haugh and General Kruse, who are joining today for the first time as new directors of NSA and DIA. This annual hearing is a vital part of our oversight. It's a unique chance for the public to hear directly from each of you about the IC's assessment of a range of threats and issues, the stuff that we hear every single day behind closed doors. The world can sometimes feel as though it's straining under the weight of conflict. Putin's ongoing assault in Ukraine, the People's Republic of China, saber-rattling at a democratic Taiwan, the ongoing crisis in Gaza, the deteriorating situation in Haiti, I could go on. My point is, we need the public to see that we have a dedicated and objective intelligence community that can soberly present these complicated threats and challenges based on fact and rigorous analysis. We're fortunate in HPSCI to see this daily on a classified basis, and I know that your appearance here today will help reinforce that. I will return to this during my questions, but we are amid another presidential election. In previous federal campaign cycles, we know that foreign powers have attempted to interfere, and the latest assessment by the IC says it's a possibility that they may do so again. We need to ensure, and in no way do I disagree with any of the catalog of foreign threats that the chairman laid out. I agree with them in their entirety, but we need to ensure in particular that foreigners stay out of American elections, period. And we need the community to credibly collect against and warn the public when they determine that such malign activities targeting our political process are occurring. I'll be focused on this threat in the months ahead, and I'm pleased that this committee will have the opportunity to receive a classified update next week at the working level. As the IC's assessment lay out, we have seen past interference efforts by Russia, China, and Iran, among others, of different sorts, and we have every reason to believe that some or all of them will try again. I'm particularly concerned that Putin is exploring opportunities because he has already done so in part, and because he has a lot to gain. I hope you will give us a sense of what the Russian leader's calculus may look like, as well as that of other potential actors. I'll also note that this will be the first general election in the era of generative AI, which can create realistic video, photos, audio, and text at a scale and sophistication that was unimaginable just a year ago. We need to be ready. The IC's job is to focus its collective powers outward to protect our nation, but I feel strongly that some of the greatest threats to our security and the world's security, unfortunately, are homegrown. I fear that we are slouching towards an election in which decisions will be made based on what excites us, what enrages us, what enraptures us, that we will substitute for the critical faculties that are essential for a citizen in a democracy, a self-satisfied scratching of our prior beliefs and political opinions. I tell my constituents regularly that you will all work very hard, we will work hard to try to take down the temperature and restore the civility and the intelligence of our politics, but at the end of the day, Americans and their decisions about how they will act as citizens of a democracy will get the democracy that they deserve. We're faltering with a continued failure to support Ukraine. The Russian leader has been emboldened to believe that he can snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Our Ukrainian partners have fought with incredible courage against the Russian war machine, and they have won victories that were beyond anyone's expectation. It appears, however, that we have lost our nerve at the critical juncture. Director Burns, you recently returned from another visit to Kyiv. I hope you'll share with the committee some reflections on what's at stake and the urgency with which we need to act. Finally, as the chairman said, and in the category of self-imposed crises, I am deeply concerned that Section 702 of FISA expires in just over a month unless the Congress acts. As the IC witnesses can attest, 702 is our most important intelligence authority, and we need to reauthorize it right away. I appreciate all the work that the witnesses at the table have done to help make that the case, but we are not done yet. Before turning back to the chairman, I would also like to touch briefly on technology adoption and innovation in the IC. I've long championed this work and authored a report on the topic several years ago. For all of China's strengths, they cannot compete with the entrepreneurial culture and the innovation that we regularly achieve here in the United States. Getting that innovation into the IC's mission and into the DoD's mission is going to define our success over the next decades. We spend a lot of time in this place debating whether capital should flow, how IP should be protected, whether we should shut down a Chinese-owned social media platform. The merits of those efforts are open to debate, but if we continue to innovate the way we always have, we will win. So I thank you all for being here. I look forward to what will hopefully be a very valuable session for the American public, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Haines. I'll now turn to Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, who will be presenting the opening statement on behalf of the panel. Avril.
Thank you very much, Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Haines, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here alongside my wonderful colleagues to present the IC's annual threat assessment. Before I start, I want to publicly thank the people of the intelligence community. From the collector to the analyst and everyone in between, we're presenting the result of their labor at this hearing. They work tirelessly every day to keep our country safe and prosperous, and we are all very proud to represent them. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank all of you for the extraordinary support that you've shown to the intelligence community. The IC's relationship with its oversight committees, quite obviously, is critically important, and you all work with us on a bipartisan basis that is especially inspiring in today's environment, and we are grateful for your encouragement and for your wisdom. Today, the United States faces an increasingly complex and interconnected threat environment characterized by really three categories of challenges. The first is an accelerating strategic competition with major authoritarian powers that are actively working to undermine the rules-based order and the open international system that the United States and our partners rely on for trade, commerce, the free flow of information, and accountability to the truth. And the second category is a set of more intense and unpredictable transnational challenges such as climate change, corruption, narcotics trafficking, health security, terrorism, and cybercrime that often interact with traditional state-based political, economical, and security challenges. And the third category is regional and localized conflicts that have far-reaching and at times cascading implications, not only for neighboring countries, but also for the world. And all three challenges are affected by trends in new and emerging technologies, environmental changes, and economic strain that are stoking instability and making it that much more challenging for us to forecast the developments and their implications. And these dynamics are putting unprecedented burdens on the institutions and the relationships that the United States relies on to manage such challenges, and perhaps more than ever, highlight the need for sustained U.S. leadership to uphold the rules-based order. And I'll just touch on these three categories of challenges, starting with strategic competition in China, in an effort to provide some context and highlight some of the intersections. President Xi continues to envision China as a leading power on the world stage, and Chinese leaders believe it is essential to project power globally in order to be able to resist U.S. pressure, for they are convinced that the United States will not tolerate a powerful China. Nevertheless, the PRC seeks to ensure China can maintain positive ties to the United States and will likely continue to do so this year as they see stability in our relationship as important to their capacity to attract foreign direct investment. In fact, boosting the domestic economy is a fundamental priority for President Xi, yet he appears to be doubling down on a long-term growth strategy that will deepen public and investor pessimism over the near term. With youth unemployment around 14.9%, no major stimulus aimed at consumption forthcoming, massive local debts, and a property market contraction, 2024 is likely to be another difficult year for China's economy, all against the backdrop of an aging and shrinking population and slowing economic growth. And President Xi is counting on China's investments in technologies such as advanced manufacturing and robotics, artificial intelligence, high-performance computing, to drive productivity gains and spur growth in the future. Yet he is increasingly concerned about the United States' ability to interfere with China's technological goals. And consequently, in an effort to protect and promote China's capacity to compete technologically, which President Xi views as fundamental to his long-term growth strategy, PRC leaders modified their approach to economic retaliation against the United States over the last year, imposing at least some tangible costs on U.S. firms, even as they continue to moderate such actions to avoid domestic costs. And Chinese leadership is furthermore pursuing a strategy to boost China's indigenous innovation and technological self-reliance, expand their efforts to acquire, steal, or compel the production of intellectual property and capabilities from others, and continue to engage in coercive behavior to control critical global supply chains of relevance. In the meantime, President Xi's emphasis on control and central oversight is unlikely to solve the challenges posed by China's endemic corruption, demographic decline, and structural economic constraints. And over the coming year, tension between these challenges and China's aspirations for greater geopolitical power will probably become all the more apparent. And given its ambitions, Beijing will continue to use its military forces to intimidate its neighbors and to shape the region's actions in accordance with the PRC's priorities. We expect the PLA will field more advanced platforms, deploy new technologies, and grow more competent in joint operations with a particular focus on Taiwan and the Western Pacific. The role intended for China's growing nuclear forces and cyber capabilities in this effort and the ultimate intent behind unprecedented growth in these areas remain priorities for us in the IC, and they are not unrelated to the actions in Russia. President Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine continues unabated. Ukraine's retreat from Avdiivka and their struggle to stave off further territorial losses in the past few weeks have exposed the erosion of Ukraine's military capabilities and the declining availability of external military aid. The assistance that is contemplated in the supplemental is absolutely critical to Ukraine's defense right now. And without that assistance, it is hard to imagine how Ukraine will be able to maintain the extremely hard-fought advances it has made against the Russians, especially given the sustained surge in Russian ammunition production and purchases from North Korea and Iran. And meanwhile, President Putin is increasing defense spending in Russia, reversing his long-standing reluctance to devote a high percentage of GDP to the military as he looks to rebuild. And in many ways, this is prompted by the fact that Russia has paid an enormous price for the war in Ukraine. Not only has Russia suffered more military losses than at any time since World War II, roughly 300,000 casualties and thousands of tanks and armored combat vehicles, setting them back years, it has also precipitated Finland and Sweden's membership in NATO, which Putin believes requires an expansion of Russia's ground forces. Putin continues to judge that time is on his side and almost certainly assumes that a larger, better-equipped military will also serve the purpose of driving that point home to Western audiences. Such messaging is important because Putin's strategic goals remain unchanged. He continues to see NATO enlargement and Western support to Ukraine as reinforcing his long-held belief that the United States and Europe seek to restrict Russian power and undermine him. And of course, in the meantime, Russia continues to modernize and fortify its nuclear weapons capabilities, even though it maintains the largest and most diverse nuclear weapons stockpile. And we remain concerned that Moscow will put at greater risk longstanding global norms against the use of asymmetric or strategically destabilizing weapons, including in space and in the cyber domain. Another critical intersection we are monitoring is the relationship among the governments of Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran, which is evolving as these four countries expand collaboration through a web of bilateral and in some cases trilateral arrangements. This growing cooperation and willingness to exchange aid in military, economic, political, and intelligence matters enhances their individual capacities, enables them to cooperate on competitive actions, assists them to further undermine the rules-based order, and gives them each some insulation from external international pressure. And nevertheless, we assess these relationships will remain far short of formal alliances or a multilateral axis. Parochial interest, desire to avoid entanglements, and wariness of harm and instability from each other's actions will likely limit their cooperation and ensure it advances incrementally, absent direct conflict between one of these countries and the United States. Nevertheless, the power dynamics are shifting among them, and this is creating new challenges. In particular, Russia's need for support in the context of Ukraine has forced it to grant some long-standing concessions to China, North Korea, and Iran, with the potential to undermine, among other things, long-held non-proliferation norms. And as I noted in the beginning, intensifying transnational challenges are interacting with these more traditional threats. For example, with the advent of generative AI, states and non-state actors who are interested in conducting foreign malign influence operations no longer need to master a new language or create potentially believable false content. And the threat of malign actors exploiting these tools and technologies to undercut U.S. interests in democracy is particularly potent as voters go to the polls in more than 60 elections around the globe this year. And we have also seen a massive increase in the number of ransomware attacks globally, which went up roughly 74% in 2023 from what it was in 2022. And U.S. entities were the most heavily targeted. Many of these are conducted by non-state actors, with the Russia-based cyber criminal group Lockbit remaining the most popular ransomware as a service provider. Lockbit was responsible for nearly a quarter of all claimed attacks worldwide, leading to a joint effort by 11 countries to seize its resources and take down its online domains. And transnational criminal organizations and human smuggling operations increasingly exploit migrants through extortion, kidnapping, and human trafficking, and in particular, the threat from illicit drugs remains at historic levels, with Mexican transnational criminal organizations supplying and moving large amounts of synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl, into the United States. More than 100,000 Americans have died from drug-related overdoses during the past year, and most of those deaths have been attributed to illicit fentanyl. And as such, the threat from fentanyl and other synthetic drugs to the health and welfare of everyday Americans remains a top priority for the intelligence community. In the third category, we have multiple regional conflicts with far-reaching implications, perhaps nowhere more obviously than in the Middle East. And the crisis in Gaza is a stark example of how regional developments have the potential for broader and even global implications. Now, having lasted for more than 5 months, the Gaza conflict has roiled the Middle East with renewed instability, presenting new security paradigms and humanitarian challenges while pulling in a range of actors. The conflict has prompted new dynamics even as it has entrenched old ones. We continue to assess that Hezbollah and Iran do not want to cause an escalation of the conflict that pulls us or even them into a full-out war. Yet the Houthis entered the war and were willing to do so without Iran acting first, becoming one of the most aggressive actors in the conflict. And the Iranian-aligned militia groups in Iraq and Syria that have been attacking our forces have been more focused on the United States than Israel, using the conflict as an opportunity to pursue their own agenda. Moreover, the crisis has galvanized violence in a range of actors around the world, and while it is too early to tell, it is likely that the Gaza crisis will have a generational impact on terrorism. Both al-Qaeda and ISIS, inspired by Hamas, have directed supporters to conduct attacks against Israel and U.S. interests, and we have seen how it is inspiring individuals to conduct acts of anti-Semitism and Islamophobic terror worldwide. And in this third category of regional and localized conflicts, we have many more we might discuss, including Haiti, Sudan, what is happening in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and the list goes on. But this finally brings me to Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, as was mentioned, which will expel on April 19th without congressional action. The intelligence gathered pursuant to Section 702 was essential in preparing this annual assessment and is absolutely fundamental to every aspect of our work. Section 702 provides unique insights into foreign intelligence targets such as foreign adversaries, terrorist organizations, including Hamas, weapons proliferators, spies, malicious cyber actors, and fentanyl traffickers. And it does so at a speed and reliability that we simply cannot replace with any other authority. As Congress pursues reauthorization, we understand there will be reforms, and we support those that bolster the compliance and oversight regimes in place today while preserving the operational agility that is vital to keeping the nation safe, and we know how much this committee has worked on that option. We thank you very much and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director Haynes. I also want to thank Director Burns, Director Haines, Director Wray, and of course, former Director of NSA, Nakasone, for your assistance in the process that this committee undertook in drafting our 702 reforms bill and reauthorization. The reforms that are in that bill, this committee worked very diligently, responding to each of the areas where we found abuses, this bill not only continues the ability for the intelligence community to collect intelligence on foreigners abroad, not American citizens, foreigners abroad, it also addresses the concerns that we had and the concerns that have been part of the public discussion in Congress of abuses, and I appreciate the fact that you have not only cooperated with us, but you've assisted us in the overall process of drafting that and in our advocacy for it. Director Wray, you have been very public over the past several months, and including yesterday in the Worldwide Threats hearing in front of the Senate, on warning of a potential terrorist attack occurring in the United States. The intelligence that we see is clear, and I appreciate that you have publicly entered into the discussion of the threat and the concern that we are currently facing. People who want to do America harm have entered our country illegally and are here. Now, you have continued to cite that warning, and I'd like your comments on, you believe that we are at a significant risk right now here from the possibility of a terrorist attack.
I believe that the terrorist threat level that we're contending with right now is at a whole nother level from an already heightened terrorist threat level that we were seeing even before October 7th. And I say that for a variety of reasons. First, you've seen a veritable rogues gallery of foreign terrorist organizations calling for terrorist attacks against us in a way that we haven't seen in a long, long time. And these are terrorist organizations, as this committee knows very well, which often don't see eye to eye on much, but they seem to see eye to eye on this. I would add to that that we are very concerned about the risk of inspired attacks, lone actors here, inspired by some of those same calls for violence from over in the Middle East. And so this is a time not for panic, but for heightened vigilance given the risk.
Director, I'm going to ask you a couple questions about the FBI's role in designating individuals as known terrorists, suspected terrorists, and on the no-fly list. When there are concerns that an individual might be affiliated with a terrorist organization or have the intent to undertake a terrorist attack, there are designated categories: known terrorists, suspected terrorists, no-fly list, and selectee. Could you describe the FBI's role in those designations?
So the FBI maintains the so-called terrorist watch list, the known or suspected terrorist list, based on information that comes from a variety of sources. That could come from FBI investigative work, but very often it comes from information from our intelligence partners. or from other sources, other agencies. And so that's when the so-called DROG, the derogatory information about the individual, puts them on the list. And then armed with that list, that's what allows us to engage with DHS as they're running names when they come in.
Who designates someone on the no-fly list?
Well, the difference between the no-fly list and the selectee list, I guess I would say, is there are both individuals who, based on the list, don't fly or shouldn't fly, and then there are those who are identified for heightened screening. And it's an interagency process that determines who's in which category.
What's the FBI's role in that?
Well, the FBI contributes its own threat intelligence and obviously maintains the watch list itself.
And the no-fly list is maintained by the FBI?
That's my understanding.
Have any individuals who are known terrorists, suspected terrorists, or who are on the no-fly list presented themselves at the southern border or been apprehended at the southern border, crossing illegally into the United States?
We have seen over the last, I think, 5 years, an increase in the number of KSTs, or known or suspected terrorists, attempting to cross the southern border.
Have individuals on the known terrorist list, suspected terrorist list, or the no-fly list presented themselves at U.S. airports once entering the United States, attempting to fly?
I believe the answer to that is yes as well, although I don't have that right in front of me at the moment.
Have they flown?
Well, there may have been instances where, as part of an investigation in close coordination, in order to be able to then potentially apprehend somebody, somebody's allowed to fly in order to see where they're going, in order to then take action, but not intentionally.
Have individuals on the no-fly list been permitted to fly?
I believe, again, depends on what time period you're talking about, but I believe there have been individuals where, in coordination between investigators and other agencies, an individual that we want to see where they're going and be able to potentially arrest them, that there may have been situations where somebody's been allowed to fly in that kind of situation.
Does the FBI have a role if someone presents themselves at an U.S. airport with the intent to fly that is on the no-fly list? Is the FBI involved in permitting them to fly or downgrading their status for them to fly?
No. We provide information to the agency, the DHS agency that's involved at the airport screening, but the decision to allow them to fly is not ours.
Are you notified if someone from the no-fly list shows up and wants to fly?
Certainly, that's most of the time, that's my understanding, yes.
Thank you. Director Burns, Director Haines, Ukraine is a significant issue for the United States, as we are unfortunately in a position where we are caught up in a legislative process that has not yet resolved the issue of continued U.S. support for Ukraine as they struggle on the battlefield against Russian aggression. Director Burns, there are still individuals who claim that this war, this aggression by Russia, where they've invaded Ukraine, is about Russia wanting to prevent Ukraine from being in NATO, or perhaps even that Russia instigated this incursion by Russia, or that Russia itself is trying to counter NATO in Ukraine. This conflict's much more than that, isn't it, Director Burns? Help us understand this conflict. You've served as the U.S. ambassador to Russia. You know Putin well. You see the intelligence. You have been active in working with Ukraine and this administration on this issue. What is this conflict about, and what is Putin seeking in Ukraine?
I think what Vladimir Putin seeks, what caused him to launch his brutal and unprovoked invasion about 2 years ago, was his fixation on subjugating Ukraine and controlling its choices, much broader than the issue of NATO. I think Putin, and I've heard him say this many times in the past, believes that Ukraine isn't a real country, that it's weak and divided, and what Ukrainians have done is demonstrate the real countries fight back. And so I think there's a great deal at stake today in the supplemental assistance that the Congress is considering. There's a great deal at stake, not only for Ukrainians and European security, for our long-term interests around the globe, including in the Indo-Pacific.
Dr. Burns, do Ukrainians want to be part of Russia?
Sorry?
Do Ukrainians want to be part of Russia?
I think the vast majority of Ukrainians, especially reinforced by Putin's brutal invasion, want to be a part of a sovereign, independent Ukraine. That's why they've fought with such bravery and valor with our support, which has been incredibly important and remains incredibly important to their success.
Dr. Burns, if there was support in Ukraine for Russia, wouldn't we have during this conflict seen an insurgency, some uprising of individuals who were carrying the cause of Russia? And we've not seen that in Ukraine, have we?
No, what you've seen is incredible bravery and valor, as I said before, on the part of Ukrainians, which have demonstrated their commitment to a sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine.
In the areas where Russia has taken Ukraine territory, has there been peace? Are the people there safe? How is Russia treating Ukrainians once they incorporate a territory?
They're treating them as second-class citizens with a fair amount of repression as well. Just like I would add, they treat many of their own citizens.
Dr. Burns, tell us of some of the war crimes that have occurred against Ukrainian people.
Oh, I think, one of the most vicious of those crimes has been the illegal transportation and abduction, in effect, of Ukrainian children. I think that's the one that, I think strikes at all of our hearts as well.
If this was about NATO, Director Burns, would Putin be kidnapping children in Ukraine?
No, as I said, I don't think this is just about NATO. It's about that wider fixation that Putin has about subjugating Ukraine.
Director Haines, tell us what, in your review of the intelligence and your experience, what is this conflict about?
Oh, I think Director Burns stated it well. It's certainly about the subjugation of Ukraine, but also, one of the things that's very consistent with that Putin talks about is that he believes that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century is the breakdown of the Soviet Union. He perceives that they lost a tremendous amount in that context, and I think does not want to be the leader that loses even further influence over those states that were a part of the Soviet Union, and in fact wants to bring it back to its former glory. And I think the other aspect of this that is behind, the importance of our continuing to support Ukraine in their extraordinarily courageous acts in countering Russia is that China is also watching what's happening here. And I think that's one of those scenarios where if China sees that we're able, and we already overexceeded, I think, their expectations in terms of coming together with Europe and actually countering Russia in this scenario. But if they see that weaken, that resolve weaken, and our inability to maintain assistance, that is going to be a lesson that they're going to learn for the future for their own assertive efforts in their region.
Dr. Haines, tomorrow, if Ukraine or NATO or the United States said no NATO for Ukraine, would this be over?
No.
Director Burns, we have unfortunately taken a significant amount of time for Congress to act for Ukraine aid to be approved. We have stood by Ukraine. We have provided the weapons that they have needed, that they have fought. We have not fought. They have fought to counter Russian aggression with great loss. What is our delay costing now? What is happening on the battlefield? And is Ukraine at a disadvantage because we have not approved aid?
Yes is the short answer. I came back a couple of weeks ago from my 10th visit to Ukraine during the course of the war and in conversations, not just with President Zelensky, but with our intelligence counterparts and Ukrainian military officers. I was struck by several things. First, Ukraine is not running out of courage and tenacity. They're running out of ammunition, and we're running out of time to help them. I was briefed on the Battle of Avdiivka, which caused a rushed withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces about 2 days before I arrived in Kyiv. And one of the senior Ukrainian partners who was in the battle told me that our men fought as long and hard as they could, but we ran out of ammunition, and the Russians just kept coming. And what I worry about in 24, without supplemental assistance is that you're going to see more Avdiivkas, that Ukraine is going to lose more ground, notwithstanding their courage and tenacity, and maybe significant ground over time. And as Director Haines said, I think that has consequences for American interests that go well beyond Ukraine and European security. They go directly to our interests in the Indo-Pacific. I think they're likely to, that kind of an outcome will stoke the ambitions of the Chinese leadership, and they're going to undermine the faith that our partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific have in our reliability as well. With supplemental assistance, however, I think it is possible to cement a strategic success for Ukraine, for the West, and a strategic loss for Vladimir Putin, to defeat him in his goal of subjugating Ukraine and controlling its choices, to put Ukraine in a position where by the end of 2024 it can regain the initiative on the ground, but even more importantly, negotiate from a position of relative strength with Putin's Russia. I don't think Putin is serious today about negotiating. He may be interested in the theater of negotiations, but he's not interested in compromise. He's interested in negotiations where he can dictate the terms. Without supplemental assistance, I think that's the future that Ukrainians could face a year from now. With supplemental assistance, I think it's possible to puncture his arrogance, his confidence that time is on his side, and put Ukrainians in the position where they could negotiate an outcome from a position of relative strength, an outcome in which, as I said, Putin's goal is defeated. Ukraine remains a sovereign, independent state, anchored in Western institutions, and has the time and the security to recover, while Russia has to live with the long-term consequences of Putin's foolish and brutish invasion of Ukraine.
Last question, Director Burns, Director Haines. There are people in Congress who support aid for Ukraine, but believe, I believe mistakenly, that we have time, that this is not at a critical juncture, that we can take our time in approving this aid. Director Burns, Director Haines, are they mistaken?
I think, as I said before, Mr. Chairman, the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. I saw that in the description of what happened in Avdiivka. They're running out of munitions for both air defense and for artillery. You know, one of the Ukrainian brigades that fought at Avdiivka, I was told, in the 2 days before they were forced to withdraw, had a grand total of 15 155 artillery munitions per day for the entire brigade, of something like 2,500 personnel. Another brigade had a grand total of 42 mortar rounds for the entire brigade at the end of that. It's not that they didn't fight with courage and tenacity, it's that they ran out of ammunition. You can already see the Ukrainian military rationing ammunition. You can already see them becoming more vulnerable to Russian attacks from the air, from drones, from missiles, from aircraft. And that's the future we're going to see, I think, without providing them the munitions that they've used so effectively in the past, and which I believe are the key to a serious negotiation down the road.
Dr. Haines?
No, I have nothing more to add to that. I mean, I think it is urgent.
Jim Haines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I particularly appreciate your highlighting the urgency of this House acting to support the Ukrainians. Much is in the balance, so thank you for doing that. I do want to turn my attention to the topic I previewed, election interference, but since the chairman brought it up, I want to just spend a minute or two on the southern border. And let me state up front that every country needs a secure border, but I also think it's important that we put into context in a hearing called Worldwide Threats what the threats are from the southern border relative to North Korea, pandemics, Russia, China, cyber attacks, you name it. Director Wray, I guess I'll start with you. Give me a time period, choose a time period, 5, 10 years. Over a 5 or 10 year period, what percentage of domestic terrorist attacks in this country were undertaken by undocumented aliens or groups of undocumented?
Of domestic, you mean in other words, attacks here?
Domestic terrorist events.
You mean attacks here in the United States?
Exactly.
Right. I don't have a percentage. A large number of them have been conducted by what we call HVEs, homegrown violent extremists, who are inspired by ISIS.
What's the number one category of those who perpetrate domestic terrorist events? Number one category.
Well, again, the number one category of terrorist attacks here are lone actors in small cells or small groups with using readily accessible weapons against soft
I'm
targets.
asking, what I'm trying to get at here, lone actors, are they undocumented? What percentage of domestic terrorist attacks are undertaken by the undocumented?
I don't have a percentage.
Is it 50%?
No.
Is it 25%?
I would be surprised.
You'd be surprised. Okay. What percentage of the fentanyl that enters this country comes on the backs, if you will, of the undocumented relative to that percentage which comes in through legitimate ports of entry?
Again, I don't have the percentage, but I would tell you that the vast majority of the fentanyl in this country obviously comes from Mexico, the other side of the border.
Right, but it is my understanding, and contradict me if I'm wrong, that the vast majority comes through legal ports of entry. Is that your understanding as well?
I have been told that.
Okay. Would it surprise you to know that encounters on the southern border in the third year of this president's presidency, in the third year, 23, were about 80. Do you know what the encounters with known or suspected terrorists in the third year of the previous president? Do you know what that number is? It's a CBP number.
No, I don't have those numbers.
Okay.
I know that the numbers over the last 5 years is what is the information I have. Over the last 5 years, the number of encounters.
Right, well, I'm making a comparison here, and the answer to that question is that in the third year of the Biden presidency, encounters on the southern border with known or suspected terrorists is 80. In the third year of the previous administration, the equivalent number is 280. I'm sorry that we have to talk about this. It's a serious issue. I would just put it into the context of the many, many threats that we have. I'm sorry that we need to talk about this because the chairman and I were with the president in the cabinet room when then Leader McConnell said to the speaker, you will not get a better border deal if Donald Trump is president, if the Republicans control the Senate, and if they call the House. What a lost opportunity to address the problems that my Republican friends make such hay over. With that, I want to turn to what I really am concerned about, which is, in particular, foreign interference in our election. The unclassified threat assessment before us today is the latest in a string of IC analysis going back years, documenting foreign ambitions to influence our elections. I'm pleased that the community's assessment leans forward to describe these threats in such plain terms because our best defense is ensuring that the Americans across the political spectrum are informed and aware of the range of adversaries and what they may do. So I want to use the remainder of my time until the chairman gavels me down around 3 questions. What does the threat look like? And by the way, just to prompt that discussion, I have reproduced what the New York Times reported on last week, which was they were a little hazy about precisely who, but they attributed to the Russians setting up 4 completely fake newspapers online. The DC Weekly, the interestingly named New York News Daily, that's not the Daily News, that's the News Daily, the Chicago Chronicle, and the Miami Chronicle. And the New York Times reported, these websites have since been taken down, that they mix local news with actual Kremlin propaganda. So I'm just putting that out there to prompt. What I'm getting at here is how can Americans identify what foreign interference may look like? Specifics. We've read that Russians may seek to start faux grassroots demonstrations. So again, I have 3 categories of questions. That's one. Number 2, and this is really important, what are you doing about it? And Director Wray, I'm going to close with you because every American has a right to know that what you're doing about this is also consistent with their protections of expression under the First Amendment. So let me devote some time now to part 1. What exactly should Americans expect to see if there are attempts to interfere with our elections, beyond what I've posted back here?
Thank you. I can start, sir. Thanks for obviously raising this issue because it's of absolutely critical importance to us. And as you noted, we have our intelligence community assessment on this that's been unclassified and released on our website on these issues. I think as we look back at the 2020 U.S. election cycle, Russia engaged in a multi-pronged effort intended to really heighten broad existing U.S. socio-political tensions and sow distrust in democratic processes. And Russia's online influence actors really sought to amplify mistrust in the electoral process by denigrating mail-in ballots, highlighting alleged irregularities, accusing the Democratic Party of voter fraud. Russia continued its efforts during the 2022 election cycle, probably with the intent to distract and weaken the United States and reduce U.S. support to Ukraine, targeting specific demographics with tailored messaging intending to elicit responses about strongly held beliefs or moral issues. And what we do about it, and obviously, you know, the point of saying that they have a multi-pronged attack is that you may see things along the lines of what you've described in the New York Times, but they also use, for example, commercial firms, others that are sort of go-betweens. They have a whole series of different ways of approaching effectively their information operations in this space. And what we do in the intelligence community is we've stood up an election security, basically, group. They have different leads from different elements that participate. And these IC elements are working collectively, effectively, to identify this type of information operations. And what we do is we provide it largely to the Department of Homeland Security and to the FBI for them to act and to interact.
Director, let me stop you there, because I really want to focus
Please.
on what it looks like. Something you said caught my attention. Accusations that the system is corrupt, that elections are rigged, which are a hallmark, obviously, of the previous president's speeches, and, to be fair, most recently raised by a California Senate candidate on the Democratic side, those statements that the systems are rigged may be designed to cause Americans to lose confidence in their electoral system. Is that fair of me to emphasize?
Yes, they have for years, the Russians have for years in their information operations been trying to basically discredit the legitimacy of our processes and ultimately our democratic system. That is one of their main objectives in information operations.
Are any of you aware, let's just get it on the record, in the last 7 years of any material evidence that American elections are rigged? Can I get a
No.
audible no? Thank you. Okay, no evidence that in the last 7 years any American elections have in any material way been rigged. Okay, thank you. Director Haines, before we move on, because I do want you to talk about what you're doing about it, but what else? We've got fake news sites. I hate to use the term, but those are fake news sites. We've got accusations that the systems is rigged, that the American government is being weaponized against Americans. What else?
Sure. There's also efforts to go after particular policy positions, to stoke divisions in society, in effect, and
How do you stoke divisions amongst Americans?
so you effectively take where there's real content, where there's disputes within American society, socioeconomic issues or otherwise, and then you effectively lift and highlight those divisions up. It's one of the more challenging things for us to identify what the impact is, because largely it's an exacerbation of an existing division, in effect, and it's one of the areas where they seek to focus.
So let's spend a minute or so on what you're doing about it. You were starting to say that you talked to DHS, and Director Wray, we're going to close because I think these efforts that you make against these attempts at misinformation and division are critical, but there is a very hazy line between identifying those efforts, going after those efforts, and compromising constitutionally protected freedom of expression and speech. So, Director Haines, give us a sense for what you're doing about it.
Sure, and I'd welcome it to the extent that you have time just to hear from some of my other colleagues. I mean, I think all of us are involved in this in many respects in supporting ultimately DHS and FBI's efforts on these questions. We stood up in ODNI the Election Threat Executive in 2019, which was incorporated into the Foreign Malign Influence Center, and that center is responsible for integrating intelligence on foreign malign influence or interference targeting U.S. elections. It also strategically manages IC collection and analytic resources on this issue and fosters partnership with other government, private, and foreign entities. And in 2022, we added the position of a National Intelligence Officer for Foreign Malign Influence and the National Intelligence Council for leading analysis across the IC on foreign influence for U.S. elections. And it's also, like, as we work with different groups, and as I mentioned, DHS and FBI, I'll let obviously Director Wray talk about FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force and their work on this, but DHS has an Office of Intelligence and Analysis, and they provide analytic and collection support regarding threats to U.S. election infrastructure, as well as U.S. organizations, campaigns, public officials, and they work closely with DHS's cyber security and infrastructure agency, CISA, as people know it, which is charged with assisting election officials and their private sector partners to mitigate risk and enhance the physical security and resilience of election facilities and equipment. And maybe just turn it then to
Yeah, thank
like
you.
or how- yeah.
These efforts are critical. Director Wray, it is essential that Americans have confidence that these issues are identified without the FBI or anybody else stepping on their constitutional rights. So give us 90 seconds of why we should be confident that you can do that.
So our focus is not on the content. Our focus is on the actor, the foreign actor. And that's a key distinction. We're not the arbiter. We don't seek to be the arbiter of what's truth or fake. What we are doing is trying to identify the hidden hand of foreign adversaries, foreign intelligence services, fake accounts that in fact belong to some foreign adversary, and alerting the right people to that. That's the primary category in this foreign line influence space. There is a second category that is important in an election year, which is lies about where and when to vote, for example, is a form of voter suppression, and that can be a crime, and there's a criminal investigation that would ensue there, and we alert the appropriate election officials so that they can make sure people know where they actually can vote and what the times the polls are open and that kind of thing, but that's a separate category.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that. I will yield back, but I've been doing this now for almost a decade and have seen, like you, every manner of threat out there. And though I have seen every manner of threat out there and appreciate their severity, I still believe what Lincoln said in 1838 in a speech he gave. Lincoln said, "America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves." Yield back.
Thank you. As a point of privilege for the chairman, I have in my hand the U.S. Customs and Border Protection encounter statistics for the years FY17 through FY24. My questions that were directed to Director Wray did not include a time period or a criticism of the administration. However, since the comparison was made, my esteemed colleague used the numbers of individuals that were encountered on the terrorist watch list in the third year of the last administration, the third year of this administration. Those encounters for the field operations encountered at land borders are the numbers that I believe you were citing, because it's the ones that relate to the ones you use, which are 280 in fiscal year 19, 80 fiscal year 23, which has been the third year of the Biden administration. Those are actual land ports where there is a field operation where someone presents themselves and there's actually a border that the people are seeking to cross. For that years of comparison, FY19, FY23, the actual aggregate, which had been the third year of the Trump administration, was 533 at those land ports, and for the Biden administration was 564, relatively consistent. However, the category that's below that, which is why I'm entering this to the record, is encounters between ports of entry, which is where it's not a specific field operation where they're entering, but they're just crossing the border. For the third year of the Trump administration, which was FY19, this report indicates that on the southwest border, the number was 0. And for the for the Biden administration, fiscal year 23 was 169. I'll enter this into the record without objection, and I now call on Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you today and have the opportunity to work with you now and over the years. I greatly appreciate it. I want to go back to something I brought up a couple of years ago and the events of June 14th, 2017 at the baseball field. I won't go into as much depth as I did a couple of years ago, but there were 136 rounds fired that day upon Republican members of Congress at the baseball field, where if Steve Scalise wasn't there and Capitol Police weren't there, he could have easily killed 20 to 30 members of Congress on the Republican side, I might add, which would have led to a change in the balance of power in the House of Representatives. I guess we didn't use the term that much back then, but I guess we'd consider it an insurrection. This is someone who came to kill Republicans. He had our names and descriptions in our pockets. ODNI and DHS came out and determined this was domestic violent extremism, yet the FBI claimed that it was suicide by cop. Now, Director Wray, that was not on your watch, And we've had this conversation. They made this determination without talking to the witnesses or the victims. And 2 years ago, after I spoke on this in this hearing, you responded to me, and I appreciated that, and you changed that from suicide by cop to domestic violent extremism. But you know, we have serious players on this committee today, and I think that we all work well together. We want to work with the intelligence community as one nation. 2 years ago, I said we need walls around us sometimes, but not walls between us. And I'm afraid that's still what we're finding. We have the responsibility of oversight. As a matter of fact, I'm the oversight chair for this committee. And, you know, we fund your agency. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. And our efforts can only be productive if we can proceed with the speed of trust. And that requires that we have a process that is where there's accountability. And you know, when you have the leading investigative body in the United States of America that conducts an investigation, they don't talk to the witnesses, they don't talk to the victims, and they reach a bizarre conclusion that no one else could reach, even you couldn't reach it, and you changed their conclusion. We have to have accountability when the process is curiously insufficient here. You know, we want to make sure that there's integrity, professionalism, appropriate methodology that's taking place. But yet, as I'm seeking information as far as who made this decision to call it suicide by cop and who went forward with that, how did they conduct their investigation, we're being blocked. It's inappropriate. I don't even think it's lawful. And I know that there's time to cite the Lindner memo that comes out of Department of Justice. That's a memo. That's not the law. It isn't the law of the land. We are a country of we, the people, and we're the representatives of the people. And especially on this committee, when we inquire what's going on in the FBI and who's doing what and how is the process flawed, in an effort, we want to make it better. But we can't do it if you won't talk to us, if you won't give us the information we need, and don't allow us to investigate. It comes across as very contemptuous against this body and the people. And that's a problem. And I want to continue to move forward so we can have a better process in place and make sure that our agencies are functioning at a high level of professionalism and competency. But you have to work with us. So I'm going to ask you, and maybe it'll be in a classified setting that we do this, and that's fine. But you commit to providing this committee the name of the person who practiced this gross negligence and potentially politically motivated decision. I don't know, because we can't investigate, as well as any punitive actions the person or persons involved in this may have faced, so that we can investigate further, maybe create a better process. Will you commit to that with me?
Well, Congressman, let me just say first, as we've discussed before, no conversation on this subject should proceed without first saying how much I respect your heroism on the day in question, and I've appreciated our conversations. I know we have provided all sorts of information in a variety of settings to you in your office, and many of which would not something that normally would be shared about investigation. So we will continue to try to work with you. I will double down on our efforts to see if there's more information we can provide to be more responsive.
I don't want to have to take further action. I want it to be an acquiescence that we can work together because, look, the law says this is under general congressional oversight. The Congressional Intelligence Committees are kept fully and currently informed of the intelligence activities of the United States. That's to be ensured, it says. So the Lindner memo means nothing. It's not law. You can't write laws for yourself. Congress writes the laws. I appreciate that. There's things that I'll talk about more in the classified setting that are of grave concern to me, such as biothreats and fentanyl, and I just want to publicly comment on how grateful in those arenas I have been in working with Director Haines and Director Burns. Thank you very much. I think there's a lot more we can do so that we can be better in the future and see how well we've done on so many things already. And we'll do more in the classified setting. I yield back.
Mr. Kruse.
Thank you, Chairman. Director Haines, Odie and I last year published the IC's annual demographics report for fiscal year 2022. I'm concerned, ma'am, that despite progress, the report once again highlights ongoing disparities for minorities and women employed in the IC compared to the rest of the federal workforce. This includes decreases in number of pay grade increases, representation at the highest pay grades, and promoting and retaining these officers as they approach leadership ranks. I'd like your response, as well as responses from the CIA, DIA, NSA, and FBI on the following questions. Ma'am, when will we finally see sustained documented progress on these key benchmarks? What is holding the IC back? Where can the IC improve in its recruitment efforts specifically? Do you feel comfortable with how the IC is engaging with underrepresented communities and institutions of higher learning, such as through Centers for Academic Excellence? Also, what additional resources could be used to effectively improve recruitment from all backgrounds and walks of life?
Thank you so much, sir. So this is an issue that I'm obviously quite passionate about, and I know we've had conversations on as well. I think there is no question that we are not where we want to be in terms of the representation that we see of minorities and women and persons with disabilities in the IC, in terms of it reflecting the broader country. And as we note in the report and in the last report, we started to do some intersectionality to show some of the challenges that exist across these groups. We also see that the representation, when you look at the IC as a whole, is one thing. When you look at the upper ranks, you basically see that it is significantly lower in a number of specific minorities. And so here's a couple of things that we're doing. First of all, the recruitment piece is a piece, although that is a place where we've seen it get better, in the sense that what you see in terms of applicants for the IC is actually a fairly robust demographic mix, in a sense, for the IC. That doesn't mean that we don't need to continue to improve that. And we've been trying to get out to different parts of the country. And you mentioned the Centers of Academic Excellence. These are grants that we give to key universities. We basically work with those universities to have programs that help us to recruit from those schools and from a coalition of schools that are attached to them. And one of the things that it was intended to do was to help us to get to more diverse populations across the United States. And what we're doing right now is actually trying to apply metrics to it to demonstrate where it's working and where it may not be, and see if we can, sort of take advantage of best practices where we do see improvement. So that is sort of one piece. But another key element, and you'll see this in the demographic report that's just coming to Congress, will be here this month, that one of the key challenges we're finding is actually retention in that sort of first 5-year period of diverse employees. And that's an area that we're really trying to sort of dig into. And this is where resources matter. So let me explain what I mean by that. In order to understand why we're having challenges with retention, particularly of diverse populations, we need to collect data. We need to do more, essentially, exit interviews, do a variety of barrier studies, other things that help us to understand what's happening across the IC. And that's something we've requested money for in our DEIA budgets for the IC. And that will help us then understand what's happening so that we can actually address the challenges that are being seen and see if we can actually promote programming that helps us. And we have seen some places where the sort of cycle that we're trying to create, which is gather the data, understand what's happening, and then take action to try to fix it and see whether or not that works, is actually having an impact. And I think, for example, my Director Kruse may tell you a little bit about what's happening in DIA as an example of this, but it is a very long-term process. This is something that is going to take a while. So to your question of when are we going to see it, I think in years it is longer than any of us want it to be. It is something that we push very hard on, but I am also very just appreciate your advice and thoughts on things that we can do better in this area as well. Let me let others talk as you like. I don't.
Sure. Yeah, sure, Congressman. I'll be very brief, but I share and have shared over the 3 years I've been director at CIA the high priority attached to making ourselves a more diverse institution, and that's not just the right thing to do for us as Americans; it's the smart thing. CIA operates in a lot of extremely diverse landscapes around the world, so we're making progress. Last year, for example, we had one of the highest percentages in terms of new officers we've ever had of women and minority underrepresented community officers, 48% women, 30% minority. And equally important in terms of promotion into the senior intelligence service, the most senior jobs at CIA, we hit an historic high over the more than 3/4 of a century of CIA, 47% women, 27% minority. Because the key to retention, as I've learned the hard way over many years in public service, is you got to show people that if their work merits it, whatever their background, they could get promoted to the most senior jobs in the agency. So this is just a step. We got to continue this so that it's not just a blip, it becomes a pattern, but that's what we're determined to try to do.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. This is important that we have these conversations periodically out in the open, because I think it's important for the American people to understand that we have the responsibility of overseeing your agencies. And so let me just get right into a couple of questions here. Director Wray, do you still believe that the biggest threat to the United States national security is domestic violent extremism?
I believe that the most significant terrorist threat to the United States is lone actors acting with readily accessible weapons, targeting soft targets, and that includes both domestic violent extremists and what we call homegrown violent extremists, which are jihadists, typically ISIS-inspired violent extremists.
So I have some concerns about the potential for important industries to be attacked, and national security industries, for example, agriculture. In the last IAA, we were able to get basically to bring USDA into the IC with Title 50 authority, so that they become a member of the IC, and with all the subject matter expertise that implies and how important that is in the safeguarding of our food supply. I have some concerns about other industries. For example, I read an article earlier this week about Chinese manufacturers of cranes at our ports. Unfortunately, they're the only manufacturers of cranes. We don't build those types of things, unfortunately, in this country. But the Chinese have sought to seed our supply chain with all manner of surveillance devices and so on. The cranes were found to have been seeded with some devices. We've seen this with the manufacture of commuter rail. We've seen it with other supply chain components that they've seeded into our supplies. Do you have some concerns about that? And if so, what are you doing to reach out to the industry to make sure that we're safeguarding against those kinds of things from happening?
I think you've put your finger on a very important point. It's something that we refer to typically as the hybrid commercial threat, which is essentially what could otherwise be legitimate businesses, but that can be leveraged by the Chinese government to engage in espionage or pre-positioning for potentially disruptive action and so forth. And it's something that we talk about a lot, and we've talked about, I've testified about in terms of cyber penetration of critical infrastructure, but there are other ways, and you're putting your finger on one of them, to get control over critical infrastructure, which is through ordinary business transactions.
So we've put this authority, Title 50 authority in USDA. Can you think of some other agencies that we might need to consider that same perspective?
Let me give some thought to that, and would love to circle back with you on this, because I think this is one of the maybe less talked about, but maybe most important dimensions of the China Communist Party threat that I think does deserve attention and does require engagement, because you're talking about activity that is itself, for the most part, lawful, but still presents vulnerabilities that the Chinese government can exploit, and then we need to figure out a better way to tighten that up. I would love to engage with you on it.
While I've got you, Director Wray, I have to say that we've had some difficulty over the last few months trying to really tap into the expertise that your agency brings. Your organization continues to hold the role of lead for counterintelligence within the IC. You have a lot of very experienced counterintelligence agencies within your workforce, and they bring a valuable perspective to the table. And even so, this committee has really struggled to be able to get access to those individuals when we've asked the FBI to participate in hearings. So my question is, why are we only allowed to hear from your intelligence analysts with approved talking points?
I'm not aware that that is a restriction that we have.
Well, I hope not, because that's the presentation we got in our latest engagement with the FBI, which was unsatisfactory. Why does CIA agents briefing this committee have to defer to headquarters analysts to provide perspectives on the CI threat when this is such an important issue and they have such a vast expertise?
Defer to headquarters? Well, I mean, our counterintelligence division is a headquarters division. Are you referring to people in the field office?
What I'm referring to is when we bring someone in as a witness and we ask them questions and they say, I'm sorry, I have to defer to headquarters on that. Why are they here then? We ask them to come in to inform the committee so that we can learn what's taking place out there, and yet we sort of get stonewalled and there's a back and forth about how they can't say this or they can't say that, in a secure setting, I might add. And so much so that they've even suggested that, well, you're not cleared for that. And I have to say, again, we are cleared for it because we're the ones that oversee the agency. So I find it insulting when I hear someone from your organization suggest that we're not cleared to accept or to hear certain information in the CI space or any other space that you have purview.
So obviously what you're saying concerns me greatly, and let me have my staff follow up with you so we can get the specific examples and I can see what we can do to mitigate that.
Thank you, I appreciate that. My time's expired.
Mr. Kester.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony today. And Director Burns, thank you so much for your effort on achieving a peace agreement with return of the hostages and a ceasefire. Thank you to the President for calling for a ceasefire and the administration. I want to ask you about part of your testimony yesterday in the Senate in regards to Gaza and the situation there. Yesterday at the Senate Select Committee's hearing, you said regarding Gaza that, quote, the reality is that there are children who are starving and that, quote, they're malnourished as a result of the fact that humanitarian assistance can't get to them. Can you speak to what impediments there are to humanitarian assistance getting to civilians in Gaza and who is responsible?
I think the challenge is a very real one, and I think it's just a fact that, you know, children face incredibly difficult circumstances, in fact, desperate circumstances, especially in North Gaza. It's partly a function of humanitarian assistance just not getting there in the quantities that are required. It's partly a function of it not being distributed in conditions in which, you know, conflict is still going on, and that's why, as I tried to emphasize yesterday, I think it's so important that we continue to work with our partners in Israel and Qatar and Egypt to try to produce a deal, an agreement, which would involve not only the release of a significant number of hostages and ultimately all of the hostages, because, you know, they're in desperate circumstances and so are their families, but it would also provide for an exchange with a defined number of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. It would allow for at least a 6-week ceasefire. As a step toward more enduring arrangements. And I think in terms of humanitarian assistance, it would allow practically not only for a very significant surge in humanitarian assistance coming in, but under the conditions of a ceasefire, you could actually distribute it effectively. So
but let me ask you, Director, and I appreciate all of that work. I think it's incredibly important to end the dire situation there. But you are intimately familiar with what's going on the ground. You were in the middle of negotiations. You're a longtime diplomat and a skilled negotiator. And on top of all of this, who is responsible for keeping that humanitarian assistance from getting to the starving children of Gaza?
I think anybody who has an interest, and I think all of us feel this deeply, to produce the kind of humanitarian assistance that's so obviously required, has an interest in trying to get this deal done. I think, as the president has made clear, Israel has the right to defend itself, especially after the brutish attack that Hamas.
Sure, and nobody disagrees with that.
Right, but at the same time, as the president has made clear, Israel has an obligation to try to protect civilians, particularly innocent women and children.
I have to get to one more issue after this.
Can I just add one thing, though?
Sure, of course.
Congressman, Hamas also bears responsibility for this as well. And if Hamas is interested in the fate of women and children and innocent civilians in Gaza, it will also work hard to try to produce this kind of an agreement.
But you agree that even in wartime, there are obligations by all sides that humanitarian assistance reaches civilians. Is that correct?
Yes, I do.
And U.S. law and the Humanitarian Aid Corridor Act prohibits foreign assistance to countries, quote, when it is made known to the president that the government of such country prohibits or otherwise restricts, directly or indirectly, the transport or delivery of the United States humanitarian assistance. So let me ask you a quick follow-up. As the president's principal advisors on the matters of intelligence, has the president been made aware of the government Israel directly or indirectly prohibiting or otherwise restricting U.S. humanitarian assistance to Gaza?
I think, and Director Haines can speak to this too, but of course we provide, every bit of intelligence that we have about that issue and everything else.
And like I said, I have one more question on an important declassification question, but has the president been made aware of this? Matt Miller had made a very clear comment that Israel did have some role, at least, in blocking that assistance. Does the president know that?
I mean, I think the president's made clear that Israel can and should do more in terms of ensuring that humanitarian assistance gets in.
Okay, thank you all. Directors Wray and Director Burns, in recent decades, the United States intelligence community has worked to reform practices that led to the illegal disruption and infiltration of peaceful civil rights movements, particularly in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I'm sure you're aware of some of the most egregious examples of this behavior, including FBI's COINTELPRO operation against the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and CIA's Operation Chaos. Yesterday, I sent a letter asking your agencies to declassify and release, to the greatest extent possible, materials related to surveillance of the Latino civil rights movement, if any exist in your holdings. And I want to ask you whether you'll commit to working with me to improve the historical record and ensure that U.S. intelligence agencies can correct the mistakes of the past with regard to surveillance of Latino civil rights organizations.
Yes.
We'll review your letter and see what we can provide.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I yield back.
Ms. Stefanik.
Director Wray, have you read Robert Hur's special counsel report?
I have reviewed it.
Do you believe Joe Biden mishandled classified information?
I'm not going to discuss the report. That's the special counsel's report, and I've referred to
In your opinion as director of the FBI, do you believe he mishandled classified information?
Again, I'm just going to refer to the report, and the special counsel can speak for himself on his report.
Are you aware, and this is breaking news right now, are you aware that there's an audio recording of Joe Biden saying to his ghostwriter in February of 2016, quote, I just found all the classified stuff downstairs, end quote? Are you aware of that audio recording?
Again, I would just respectfully refer you to the special counsel.
No, I'm asking you,
himself.
are you aware as director of the FBI? You're either aware or you're not.
I'm aware. Am I aware of what now?
Whether the audio exists of Joe Biden saying in February 2017, quote, I just found all the classified stuff downstairs, end quote, to his ghostwriter.
Again, I'm just going to refer to the special counsel and his testimony and his report.
It sounds like you might be aware of it then. In front of this very committee in an open session, your predecessor, Jim Comey, testified that he did not follow the proper protocol regarding the notification of Congress of the opening of the Crossfire Hurricane, that would be the counterintelligence investigation into President Trump in 2016. To address this illegal abuse of power by the FBI, this committee included direction to the FBI in the IAA requiring notification to congressional leadership of any counter-intel investigation into a federal candidate for office. Is there any counterintelligence investigation into either Joe Biden or Donald Trump?
I would just say I will refer you to the special counsel has.
That's not a question about the special
investigation.
counsel.
Right.
That's a requirement in the IAA of the FBI. Is there a counterintelligence investigation into either Joe Biden or Donald Trump?
There's no investigation that I could confirm here, no.
Is there a counterintelligence investigation?
Again, I'm not confirming any investigation into either candidate.
Are you aware that you're required by the IAA to notify Congress of any counterintelligence investigation?
And we will comply with the law.
Have you already complied with the law? Has there been a notification?
I believe we have been in compliance with the law.
You believe you have been, or has there been a notification to Congress of any counterintelligence investigation of a federal candidate?
I believe we have complied with the law.
Has there been a counter-intel assessment conducted on either President Biden or President Trump?
Again, there's no assessment that I would confirm here in any way. I believe we have been in compliance with the law.
How about on an immediate family member, and by that I mean spouses or children, of either President Biden or President Trump?
Again, I'm not in the business of confirming, especially not in open hearings, assessments or anything like that when it comes to counterintelligence matters.
So you will confirm in the classified setting when we ask you this question of whether there's a counterintelligence investigation, because you are aware that according to the IAA, you are required by law to notify Congress of any counterintelligence investigation, not just for presidential candidates, but any federal candidate.
We will comply with the law.
So you will answer this in the classified hearing later today?
We'll comply with the law.
And what's your understanding of the law?
There's a whole series of oversight requirements that we have related to counterintelligence matters. I'm not going to try to go
But
through all of
specifically
them
the
here.
notification of Congress of a counterintel investigation onto a federal candidate. What is your understanding of the law?
Again, I would want to refer to the lawyers to make sure that I'm appropriately complying with it, but I can tell you we're going to comply with the law, and my understanding is we have been.
Is your assessment that you're required to notify Congress of any counterintel investigation into any federal candidate?
I'm going to defer to the lawyers as to the precision of that.
You're the director of the FBI. They report to you. What is your understanding of the requirement in the IAA?
We're going to comply with the law, including whatever's in the IAA.
I want to turn to the search warrants and the search. In one case of Mar-a-Lago, an unprecedented raid and a search working with Joe Biden's legal team. Were you or your staff, did you have any communication about either the execution of the search warrant on Mar-a-Lago or the search of documents working with Joe Biden's lawyer? Was there any communication with Joe Biden, of you or your team?
Not to my knowledge.
With any White House staff?
By me or my team?
By you or any personnel at the FBI?
Again, I want to make sure I've got your question right. By me or my staff, with who about which?
With the White House staff about the execution of a search warrant on Mar-a-Lago or the search working with Joe Biden's lawyers of classified information?
Not to my knowledge.
What about the Attorney General?
I can't speak for the Attorney General.
No, was there any communication with your staff, with the Attorney General, or you, regarding the execution of the search warrant or the search of Joe Biden's classified documents?
Well, any search would be done in coordination with the Department of Justice as to who may have communicated with whom.
I'm asking
between
if
the
you-
FBI and the Department. I can't.
I'm asking if you communicated
Whether I communicated.
with the Attorney General prior or after the execution of the search warrant on Mar-a-Lago.
No.
Do you think it is a national...
Hold on, prior or after?
Prior or after?
Well, I would have had conversations with the Attorney General about the appointment of, at that time, Mr. Lausch,
And what were those conversations?
just about the fact that he was going to be named. But that's not really about the search itself, I suppose.
And my last question is, do you think it is a national security threat to have a federal campaign account on TikTok?
Well, I've been very clear about my views about TikTok and the national security concerns it presents, and we ban TikTok on all FBI devices. As to what campaigns choose to do with their platforms, I'll leave that to them.
So you don't think it's a national security threat?
I'm not weighing in on that, no.
As the director of the FBI, I agree with you that TikTok is a national security threat. I think it's a national security threat to have campaign accounts on TikTok. You cannot say here today that you think that's a national security threat?
I think TikTok represents all sorts of national security threats. As to whether specific account holders choose to exercise their right to access a TikTok account, I'll leave that to them.
Well, we have a disagreement. I think it's a national security threat to have a presidential campaign on TikTok. Yield back.
Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Last week, Director Wray, Chairman Gallagher, Mike Gallagher, and I introduced a bill to address TikTok, which you have spoken about before, and actually in last year's Worldwide Threat Assessment hearing in March of last year, you said, quote, "TikTok is a tool that ultimately is within the control of the Chinese government, and it, to me, screams out with national security concerns," correct?
Correct.
So Mike Gallagher and I introduced this bill, which requires the divestment of TikTok from ByteDance. ByteDance, as you know, is the parent company of TikTok and is controlled ultimately by the Chinese government. Now, interestingly, after we introduced this bill, it got marked up in the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And interestingly, on the morning of that markup, a certain pop-up message and push notification went out to thousands and thousands of users across the country, and it looked like this. Essentially, it said, quote, "Stop a TikTok shutdown. Congress is planning a total ban of TikTok." Now, of course, setting aside the misinformation of this message, we are not calling for a ban of TikTok, but a divestment. What was very interesting to us is that the app actually used the geolocation targeting data associated with minor children to push this notification to them, to cause them to then call many congressional offices with thousands and thousands of phone calls. Now, when they called these offices, they asked the questions such as the following: what is Congress? What is a congressman? Let me have my TikTok back. And on top of that, in one case, one member of the Energy and Commerce Committee had someone call in impersonating his son, asking to speak with his dad and ask him to allow TikTok to come back. So, Mr. Wray, you've also talked about various threats associated with TikTok, including its ability to potentially mobilize public opinion. This particular push notification pop-up ended up convincing many members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee that day to change from being lean yeses to being hard yeses, because they felt this was exactly the nature of the threat that the legislation was being proposed to address. So could you just talk about whether this is an example of the type of mobilization of public opinion that TikTok, under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, might conduct in the future?
Well, while I can't speak to the specific example, I can tell you that the kind of thing you're describing illustrates why this is such a concern. I think Americans need to understand that distinctions that we take for granted in our system between businesses and government, between the businesses and the government itself, don't exist for all practical purposes in China. So Americans need to ask themselves whether they want to give the Chinese government the ability to control access to their data, whether they want to give the Chinese government the ability to control the information they get through the recommendation algorithm, and whether they want to give the Chinese government the ability to leverage the data, the software on their devices, which allows the Chinese government to compromise their devices if they so choose to exercise.
And just let the record reflect that when you were talking about the type of algorithm or example of what could happen, you were pointing to this very poster with the pop-up menu. Let me just make it clear. You cannot rule out that the Chinese Communist Party actually ordered this particular pop-up to appear on people's phones that day, right?
That's right, and I think it illustrates why when it comes to the algorithm and the recommendation algorithm and the ability to conduct influence operations, that is extraordinarily difficult to detect. And that's what makes it such a pernicious risk.
And that's the problem. You can't tell. Because the CCP ultimately controls ByteDance, ByteDance can manipulate the algorithm and has access to all this data. Now, Director Haines, in this year's threat assessment on page 12, you said TikTok accounts run by a PRC propaganda arm reportedly targeted candidates from both political parties during the U.S. midterms in 2022, right? Can you just speak up?
Sorry, yes, I was just getting to the page, apologies.
So just to be clear,
Yeah.
TikTok has already been used to influence the elections in 2022. And then on that same page it says TikTok could, quote, attempt to influence elections in 2024. So, Director Haines, you cannot rule out that the CCP could, again, just like they did here, use TikTok as a platform to influence 2024 elections, right?
We cannot rule out that the CCP could use it, correct?
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank the witnesses for being here. Director Wray, I just want to kind of double tap on what Congressman Dr. Winstrup talked about. I do not feel like we've been completely giving the files from the 2017 baseball shootings and all the relevant information. I feel like there's been a serious lack of transparency there. I appreciate what you've done, but we've not, everything's been redacted or in PowerPoints. And being a lawyer by profession and a former prosecutor, there may be things in there that I would see that other people don't see, and vice versa. So I just ask that we open this up and be transparent. It's not okay to keep that information, especially since the perpetrator, that terrorist who attacked us that day, it's been over 7 years and he was killed that day. So there is no reason for any lender arguments or anything else that are left there. We need to know who those people are who made those decisions so that there can be accountability, or at least see if there's been accountability. The second thing is I'm very concerned with the number of people that we are catching, and even more concerned by those that we are not catching, that are crossing our southern border, and I don't care which administration, that are on the terror watch list or are known or suspected terrorists. When we apprehend or touch them at the border, what part does the FBI have in either tracking, arresting, sending back? Are we coordinating with Homeland Security Director Wray to make sure that these people are not, because I think they're here to do us harm. When and where, I don't know, but what is the FBI doing once we know there's a known or suspected terrorist or someone on the watch list at our border?
So when someone is apprehended, whether at the border or otherwise, their names are run against the terrorist watch list, the FBI maintains the watch list, and so we provide the hit, if you will, back to DHS so they know this person is on the list. I mean, that's a short version, but that, and then for instances where for one reason or another somebody gets into the country, then the FBI, through our Joint Terrorism Task Forces, working with state and local law enforcement, have the responsibility of trying to find, apprehend, and then get back to DHS some of those same individuals.
At an airport, if a suspected or known terrorist or one that was on the watch list landed in DCA today, would the FBI respond to that person who landed at DCA? Would you respond to that and in conjunction with Homeland?
If we knew that someone who was on the watch list was landing at a particular airport, let's say, there would be, most of the time in my experience, communication between DHS and FBI, and depending on the circumstances, FBI might deploy to that scene, for example, to interview. If there's cause to arrest, obviously arrest, but it again depends a little bit on the particular circumstances.
And are we confident that with every interaction we have with a known suspected terrorist or someone on the watch list at the southern border or any other border, that the FBI is responding and that we know where those people are within the United States, that they're either arrested, deported, or tracked within the United States for every single encounter of a known or suspected terrorist or someone on the watch list?
So let me answer that question this way. There are a few different categories of people that we have concerns about. When a known or suspected terrorist, as in known that they are a known or suspected terrorist, is apprehended at the border, I'm confident that in the vast majority of instances, there's very close lash-up between FBI and DHS on it. The bigger concern, though, is a situation, for example, where somebody presents, say, fake identification documents at the border, and there's not biometrics to match up, so there's no way to be able to know that they're not who they say they are. Then they get into the country. Then somehow we find out that they, in fact, are somebody who's on the list. At that point, then we've got to go hunt down and try to find them. That's one category, or there may be some other way in which somebody gets
Thank you. I only have 39 seconds. Director Haines, first of all, look forward to seeing you, I think, this month or next month in my district. Second, the southern hemisphere and North Africa, especially north of the Sahel, we have a lot of challenges politically, and we have a lot of great competition there. What assets or what things do the intelligence community need to make us safer in America, both in the Southern Hemisphere and in North Africa?
Thank you so much, sir, and I am very much looking forward to my trip to Mississippi. I am, I'd say in those areas, I agree with you, we have tremendous challenges. We haven't spent as much time, obviously, this hearing on many of them. The things that we need, I think we are asking for in our budget in the context of our work there, is largely about just making sure that we have sufficient resources within the intelligence community to provide analysis, collection, all of the things that we normally do in these areas in order to be able to help all of you have a better sense of what's happening and where there are sort of key events that you might be able to affect so as to actually reduce some of the tensions and threats that exist. And there are many. I recognize, given the time, I probably can't start going through them, but if there's anything in particular that you want us to focus on, please let us know.
Thank you, and with that, I yield back. My time's expired.
Mr. Crow?
Thank you, Chairman. Director Haines, you've outlined the atrocities that Russia has committed in Ukraine. Last year, this body passed a statutory provision to create a Russian atrocities special coordinator within the IC. You have appointed this position. You have moved forward and are complying with it, which I thank you for that effort. That position, the Intelligence Community Coordinator for Russian Atrocities Accountability, my understanding is working. Can you just share with us very briefly what you're learning, how this process is working, and how it might be a model for other instances?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for your support for this issue and your efforts to help us essentially produce this. So this is the person that we have as the coordinator is somebody who has long history and knowledge on working on accountability issues in intelligence. And it's maybe a specialized field in the sense that part of what you're trying to do is best understand what kind of information is going to be useful for promoting accountability in these areas. So that means understanding what the policymakers, what the Department of State and the Department of Justice, who are typically the ones that are effectively making determinations in this area, really need as evidence in order to actually produce accountability. And then how it is that we draw that together and provide it to those institutions in ways that ultimately may be releasable for various bodies and folks that are working on these issues, and how we can help to therefore promote greater awareness within our policy community on these issues. And one of the things that he's done is really working across the IC, but also with folks at the State Department, at the Department of Justice, who are consistently iterating with him on what is needed in this space in order to produce that kind of flow. So I do think it is serving already as a model. We've also appointed him in the context of accountability with respect to Chinese and PRC issues, according to the law that requested that we do so. And I think he's been helping develop a kind of an educated community of interest within the community on these issues.
I appreciate your leadership on that. Director Wray, you said earlier in the hearing that there is a veritable rogues gallery of terrorist organizations who have now articulated threats against the United States recently, and that there's been a surge of those threats, including among groups who previously don't get along. They've kind of found common cause against threats in the United States. What's causing that surge in threats?
So these are all foreign terrorist organizations that have leveraged the conflict in the Middle East as their excuse to serve as a rallying cry to their followers.
Meaning the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza?
Correct.
So that war is causing a surge in threats against the United States?
Correct.
Okay, and in what way? Like, how are they leveraging it? Could you provide more detail?
Well, it varies a little bit depending on the organization, but for example, we've seen Al-Qaeda call for its most specific call for attacks against the United States in, I think, the last 5 years. And so they're invoking both Hamas's success, brutal, horrifying, unacceptable success on October 7th, and the conflict, of course, that's then emerged as Israel's tried to defend itself.
Does that include the number of civilian casualties in Gaza? Has that been a part of the articulation and the leveraging that you've seen from these groups?
It probably depends on the specific group, but some of them, sure.
Okay. Director Burns, you spent your career in national security and decades helping us fight our war on terror. Based on that experience, do you believe that it's possible to destroy a terrorist ideology or an ideology that underpins a terrorist organization with military force alone?
Oh, I mean, I think military force can severely degrade, the terrorist military capacities of any terrorist group, and that's a fairly well-defined goal. When you're talking about a movement or an idea or an ideology, in my experience, the only way you kill that or destroy that is with a better idea.
And what would those better ideas include in your professional opinion?
Well, I mean, I think setting aside for a second, the understandable goal of destroying the capacity of a terrorist group, I think you have to provide more broadly, and this is more a function of policy and diplomacy than intelligence, but it's, a sense of hope, a sense of purpose, in this case for Palestinians, so that, there's a way of undermining the ideology of groups like Hamas.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. LaHood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for your service to our country, and also the men and women that serve under you that allow us to live in the greatest country in the world. I want to focus on Section 702 in FISA, which has already been talked about. Over the last 15 months, this committee under Chairman Turner has looked at how do we fix and reform 702, and the statutory obligation that we have going back to 2008 when 702 was created. Every 5 years, we figure out what we revise, what we fix, how do we make 702 better. We did that in 2013, we did that in 2018, and now we have an obligation and responsibility to do it this time. We focused on 3 different areas on how to do that. One, how do we hold the FBI accountable in making sure that the abuses that have been articulated over the last 5 or 6 years don't happen again? Secondarily, how do we make sure that what happened with Crossfire Hurricane and Carter Page never happens again? And thirdly, how do we bring more transparency and openness to the FISA court to open up a little bit more? Our bill that we put together does exactly that. We reduced by 90% the amount of FBI agents and analysts that can do U.S. person queries. We prohibit the FBI from querying for evidence of a crime. We create specific criminal penalties and punitive measures for 702 leaks. We make the FBI compensation contingent on all query compliance. We mandate independent audits of all FBI U.S. person queries, and we prohibit queries to suppress Americans' political opinions or religious beliefs. On making sure what happened in Crossfire Hurricane never happens again, we create enhanced criminal penalties for those that violate FISA, leak FISA applications, or lie to the FISA court. We give the FISA court the authority to prosecute for contempt, and we prohibit the use of political opposition research and press reports to get a FISA order. Lastly, on the FISA court, for the first time ever, we now mandate transcripts for what goes on in the FISA court. We assign counsel to scrutinize U.S. person surveillance applications, and we require the same FISA court judge to rule on surveillance extensions. Those are the reforms and the feedback that we got from personnel on how we fix this process. And I would like to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, a letter to Speaker Johnson on December 7th, 2023, that supports our bill from Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State and Director of National Intelligence, John Radcliffe, Devin Nunes, William Barr, and Robert O'Brien, in which they say that Section 702 must be reauthorized, and they also go on to say that putting a warrant requirement in there is not what they recommend. If I could submit that for the record.
Objection.
There is no doubt that the value from a national security standpoint for what 702 has brought to this country is immense over the last 15 plus years. We have some that would want a warrant requirement as a part of this. In my view, that would be detrimental to 702 and the work that we've done. Director Wray, can you comment on what the warrant requirement would do to the work that you're engaged in?
So, Congressman, a warrant requirement would effectively gut the FBI's ability to use 702 to protect Americans wherever it was applied. The reality is that at the stage of an investigation where we are running these queries, it is only after we review the information that we query. Again, this is information that's already lawfully in our holdings that we're looking at when we do that. That's when we know that there may be probable cause that there's an agent of a foreign power. And so The key is to put us in a position to make sure that we continue to stay in a position where we have that agility up front. There was an example just recently where we had information that a foreign terrorist was in contact, some kind of contact, with a person believed to be in the United States. We didn't know what the nature of the contact is, but we knew that that was something that caused us interest. Now, we would not have had probable cause at that point to get a warrant to run the query, but we run that U.S. person identifying information through our holdings, and that's what allowed us to look at the content, which then suddenly showed us, whoa, this is serious, this is urgent. And within a few weeks, I think less than a month, we had disrupted an attack where it turned out the individual had weapons, bomb-making components, and other information in his home. That would never have happened without 702, and it would never have happened with a warrant requirement.
I want to switch. When we think about how essential and existential 702 has been, when I think over the last 9 years, and this will go to Director Burns, I think about instances like the taking out of al-Zawahiri, the al-Qaeda leader in Kabul. I think about taking out General Soleimani, the Iranian general, al-Baghdadi, the leader of Islamic State of Iraq, al-Sudani, the ISIS leader in Somalia, and of course Osama bin Laden. Just 5 instances over the last 9 years. Director Burns, can you talk about how essential 702 was in general for those instances and other counterterrorism actions?
Well, it was crucial in each of the areas that you mentioned, and in another area when in 2022 the United States took out both Zawahiri in Kabul, but also the Haji Abdullah, the then emir of ISIS as well. And 702 was also crucial in that operation as well. And as you know, Congressman, well beyond CT, including in the fentanyl crisis, 702 has been absolutely crucial. Last year, for example, 70% of the successful CIA disruptions of illicit synthetic drug operations came as a result of 702. So there's an expanding area of concerns and threats that are crucial to the protection of Americans that hinge on the successful application of 702 with the reforms that I know you are rightly working on.
Thank you.
Dr. Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Burns, you've already outlined the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza right now, just the urgency of getting humanitarian aid to stave off massive starvation, massive death by starvation. I applaud the president looking at getting aid in through maritime passage as well. Within that urgency and the urgency of getting an extended ceasefire, 4, 5, 6 weeks, you know, in the visits that we've had from the Saudi foreign minister, from King Abdullah, and others that you're negotiating with, there still remains that possibility of finding a peaceful, long-term solution in the Middle East where the Israeli people can live in security and feel secure, but it only comes with the ability of a Palestinian solution where the Palestinian people can also live with dignity and security. Is that your assessment?
It is.
And the longer this conflict goes on, you know, again, in my conversations with some of these foreign ministers, they have, you know, it becomes harder and harder because of what they're seeing in their streets. So there is some urgency to get that opening and then use those 4, 5, 6 weeks to negotiate a longer-term solution. Is that correct?
I think you're exactly right.
Right. Thank you. General Kruse, you've sat here patiently. Let me ask a question. As you know, I would have thought, you know, a long time ago we would have passed the Ukraine supplemental aid, and I do firmly believe that the majority of my colleagues, Democratic and Republican, firmly support the people of Ukraine and want to get this done, and we have to get it done urgently. For the American people, the American taxpayers that may question, you know, the funding, is it accurate to say that much of the supplemental funding will actually go to U.S. companies, U.S. production lines, create U.S. jobs in the defense of peace and freedom in Ukraine?
Congressman, thank you for the question, and it is accurate to say that much of the supplemental aid goes directly to Ukraine. Much of it goes to the manufacturers of all of that equipment, which will go to defense industries, among others. And some of the supplemental comes to our agencies to allow us to do the things that we need to do to both advise you and to advise the Ukrainians as they prosecute this war.
So I do think that is a really important point to the American public, to the American taxpayers, that while we're defending freedom, supporting the Ukrainian people as they defend their own sovereignty, this is not a giveaway of funds. This is, again, supporting our values as Americans, but it also will go to American jobs, American manufacturing lines, and so forth. So I think that is very, very important. Let me shift now. We do spend a lot of time looking at the threats from Russia and China, but a lot of my focus area is on the Indo-Pacific, and we're seeing on the Korean Peninsula, Kim Jong-un, starting to do a little bit of saber rattling, and he's no longer talking about unification. In the brief moment that I have, and maybe this is for Director Haines or Director Burns, can you comment on, in this setting, your assessment of what's happening in North Korea and what Kim Jong-un's, we're seeing additional ballistic tests and obviously a relationship between Putin and the North Koreans as well.
Thank you. I'll start, and please welcome, obviously, Director Burns and others weighing in on this. But I think you're absolutely right in some respects, but given the crowded environment that we are in for threats these days, the North Korea piece is not getting as much attention as it might normally get, and there have been a number of both rhetorical and actions that have been taken by Kim Jong-un that have been more provocative and in particular aimed at South Korea, at the Republic of Korea, indicating that the Republic of Korea is now enemy number one, calling for an amendment to the Constitution that makes clear that they are an enemy, doing things like blowing up, in effect, the liaison office in Kaesong between the two countries, a whole series of things that are lifting up the tensions. And we believe that it is clear that he is increasingly provocative in a sense, and there is more anxiety about the potential of him taking sort of military action, including on the northern line limit, which is basically the demarcation, the border between, the maritime border between South Korea and North Korea in the space. And I think, our analysis right now is effectively that he will engage in increasingly provocative behavior, but is not interested in escalating this into a full-on war, and that there is a kind of a limit on this. One of the challenges that we see as sort of a factor in this landscape is that he is potentially feeling increasingly emboldened by virtue of the relationship with Russia advancing as it has, and the fact that Putin needs the North now for the munitions, for weapons, for other things, and as a consequence is less likely to effectively stand up, for example, in the UN Security Council or in other places to push back against North Korea's actions when they're provocative, and particularly in the nuclear space. So I think that's something that we're carefully watching, and I think it does sort of increase the risk of miscalculation and concern, and we've been working very closely with the Republic of Korea and our counterparts there to try to manage that.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here and for your service to our nation. As we have seen time and time again, when America is strong and projects that strength, America and the world are safer. When America is weak and divided and we project that weakness, America is less safe and the world is much less safe. Director Wray, you had reminded all of us of the heightened terrorism threat. That should come as no surprise, given just in the past several years a disastrous pullout of Afghanistan, which projected weakness, a green lighting of Nord Stream 2, which projected weakness, and now, coupled with those two, a wide-open southern border, which projects weakness. And now we have people in this chamber who would, in spite of all those threats, like to strip us of our most significant national security tool, Section 702 of FISA. And Director Wray, I want you to address this myth that is being perpetuated about a so-called warrant requirement, which is not a warrant requirement at all. It's a secondary warrant requirement that has never existed in U.S. law. A warrant requirement is based on collection of data on U.S. citizens with constitutional protections. It does not apply to foreign nationals with no constitutional protections. And moreover, it does not apply, which some of our colleagues are trying to do now, to querying lawfully collected data inside a database. Taken to its logical extension, that would impose a warrant requirement on a police officer running a license plate. It would impose a warrant requirement on a fugitive squad with the marshals querying a TSA flight manifest for someone they're trying to safely arrest at an airport. It is a secondary warrant requirement. That's the policy flaw with it. Now let's focus on the numbers. Last year, the FISC signed out about 371 warrants. If we now have a warrant requirement to query a database based on the numbers last year, that would be 200,000 plus warrants. There are 750 judges roughly in the federal judiciary, about 9 to 11 rotate on and off the FISC. We'd have to expand the federal judiciary by a factor of 5, if not more. Grow the federal judiciary by 1,500 judges from 750 now. It would shut down the system. Maybe that is what some of our colleagues want to do. But for the ones that actually think that this quote-unquote warrant requirement will benefit America, Director Wray, if you could speak to this on what would the actual manifestation be of creating a warrant requirement brand new that's never existed in American law, not for collecting data, but for querying databases of lawfully collected data.
So, Congressman, you very rightly put your finger on a number of key points. The first is that there is no constitutional underpinning or legal requirement for a warrant for us to query our own information. And so this would be, if Congress were to impose one, a policy choice that Congress would be making to blind the FBI to information already lawfully in our holdings. That's important because the stage at which we're looking at that information is at the front end when we're trying to figure out what are we dealing with. Is this something that we have to be concerned about? Is this a threat? So I started to give an example, but let me unpack it a little bit more because I think it really tells the story. We had a situation where you had a known foreign terrorist individual overseas who had had some kind of contact. We didn't know what the nature of the contact was with what appeared to be a U.S. person. So we did the thing that you would all want us to do. We ran that U.S. person querying information, the identifiers associated with that U.S. person, through our already lawfully collected information to figure out what are we dealing with? Is this something to be concerned about or not? And lo and behold, when we saw the content of the communication, that's when we realized this is serious, and that led to very quick investigative action using other tools, and we disrupted a plot within, I think, less than a month. And when I say disrupted a plot, the individual had weapons, bomb-making components, specific critical infrastructure targets identified, et cetera. There is no way we could have accessed that information when we ran that initial query if we'd had a warrant requirement. It would not have happened. And so who knows what would have happened to that plot.
Well, with my remaining time, Mr. Chairman, I think it's safe to say, and this is challenging colleagues across the spectrum in this chamber, anybody advocating for what's functionally open borders, and others at that same time advocating for stripping our nation of our most critical national security tool at a time when our own director of the FBI suggests our terrorism risk is through the roof, we would be doing an incredible disservice to our country, and we'll be inviting another terror attack. I yield back.
Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very appreciative of my colleague's last statements. His assessment, I'm wholeheartedly in agreement with him about that. I would suffice it to say as well that some of those of our colleagues who may want to increase these warrant requirements and in fact shut down the system are the same individuals who have called the January 6th insurrectionists victims and patriots. And we understand that they are not. And I also understand that Director Wray and the others that are here are doing everything that's possible to ensure that we have free and fair elections, and that foreign interference cannot be a part of that. We have to stop that. And I'm grateful for your work to ensure that those enemies, foreign and domestic, are dealt with through the systems that we have in place. I had a question actually for, first for Director Burns and potentially Director Haines, if you may comment as well. As many of my colleagues on this committee know, I'm very interested in the ongoing instability in Africa, particularly in the Sahel. I'm interested in the cycle of coups, the backsliding democracies that are taking place. We are in a global fight for dominance of our adversaries, both China, Russia, particularly the Wagner Group, who are using Africa to extract wealth for themselves to the detriment of the African people and the continent. We've seen coups. Burkina Faso in the last 10 years have had 2, the Sudan 3 times, Mali twice, Chad, Guinea, Niger, Gabon. If Americans do not think that this is going to affect them, it will. The minerals, the wealth, as well as the fomenting of disease, instability, economic downfall of these countries are very much of importance to the American people. In the annual threat assessment flags of Sudan, Ethiopia, as well as additional countries that may fall, I wanted you, in considering this power vacuum, what can the United States do? How are we formulating and implementing a comprehensive strategy in the Sahel to address these challenges and opportunities that are outside of the focus that we have had on counterterrorism, which I believe needs to move away from and really focus on instability, democracy, and our fight against our foreign adversaries?
Well, thank you very much. I think the first step for us as an intelligence service is to pay attention and to help highlight for policymakers exactly what you just described, that the future of Africa is of enormous importance, I think, to the security of Americans and to the interests of our country. I was in Africa last about 6 weeks ago in East and Southern Africa, and I was reminded vividly of what's at stake for us and of the importance of the work that our officers do there to collect and analyze intelligence as well. I was the first CIA director actually in 3 of the several places that I visited, and so I think this is extremely important for us as an agency and for all of us in the intelligence community. Last year I was in the Sahel, and the challenges that you described are very real, and they've grown since then because you have a lot of predatory players, whether it's the Russians or the Wagner Group or whatever the Wagner Group will become in the future, as well as a variety of terrorist groups who are taking advantage of coups and insecurity, of the fact that some of our closest partners, like the French, are being pushed in some ways out of a role that they've traditionally played there. So there's a lot at stake for us in the United States, and certainly for us as an intelligence service. And I think all of us are determined to sustain that kind of sharp focus on Africa as we look over the rest of this year.
Thank you. And also, I know General Kruse, you may as well have some thoughts about this.
Well, I certainly do want to save time for Director Haines if she has anything she would like to add, but I would certainly say from the military intelligence side, the instability that is just heartrending that you so eloquently laid out for everybody, the contributions to that of actors that don't have the best interest of the populations in mind. Director Burns mentioned a few of those, whether it was Russia, whether it's even the enterprising and economic side of China, over $1 billion of loans, of Chinese loans, that may not be in the best interest of the populations within Africa. Just create additional angst and instability, I think, from a military perspective. And then it's a trickle-down effect to the military perspective. And then you've already talked to the 8, I think, military coups that we've seen across Africa in the last handful of years. It's a topic we do need to address, and I would defer to T&I.
I think the only thing I'd add is, Representative Plaska, I think one of the key points that you make is the sort of overlap between terrorism and insurgencies and instability, and I think that is absolutely right. And one of the things that we see in these spaces are insurgencies sometimes taking on the mantle of terrorist organizations to provide fundraising and other things, and the sort of the challenge of disaggregating these issues in a way that helps us to actually address some of the problems. And the second thing is just the the challenge that we're seeing of various actors take advantage, in a sense, of competition between major powers, in effect, to sort of allow them to alleviate some of the international pressure that they'd otherwise receive. And they try to play us all off of each other in a way that gives them more space to take some of the actions that they're taking within their own governments that are not, adding to the stability or the sort of good governance of those countries. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlelady. I want to thank our witnesses. Chairman Turner had to step out briefly, but after nearly 2 hours of testimony and 40 pages of written testimony under the annual threat assessment, I've heard very little about the open southern border policies. This is a man-made problem coming out of the White House, which poses one of the most, if not the most significant threat to our nation's security right now. I don't make that statement glibly. I don't make the following statement, which is that I feel we are more vulnerable today than we were on September 10th of 2001 as a result of not just China, not just Russia, not just the debacle in Afghanistan and Iran and its proxies in the Middle East and transnational criminal organizations, but because of our open borders. And this is a continuation of a statement that I made last year, which, as the primary advisors to the President and the White House and to the DOD for all things intelligence, your failures to convey and impart on this President the vulnerabilities of this open border policies is continuing to put us at risk. Just in the last year, we saw 2.45 million crossings across our southern border. In December alone, which was our last data set, we saw 10,000 crossings, illegal crossings across our border. And we had Lincoln Riley killed by an illegal immigrant back on February 22nd. And it's not until page 35 of 40, after climate change, that the border is even alluded to. And I use the word alluded very loosely because it's alluded to under the terms of migration. And Director Haines, you note the pressures of external political instability in countries in Central and South America as a reason for this mass migration problem that we're seeing. But the reality is that we have an open southern border as a result of policies from the White House. This president ran on these policies and is now, in my opinion, a greater threat than the sum of all of the other threats that we've discussed here today, to include Russia, to include China, Iran and its proxies, and all terrorist organizations, because they are aware of our open southern border. They are taking advantage of our open southern border. I want to talk about data. Ranking Member Haines cited data from the third years of the last administration and this administration. But here is data from the actual numbers from Customs and Border Protection figures that in 2017 there were 2 encounters of terrorists on the terrorist screening data set, or the known terrorist watch list, if you will. In 2018, there were 6 encounters. In 2019, there were 3. In 2020, there were a mere 6. And after that, it goes parabolic. We are now talking about hundreds of people coming across the border in the last 3 years, in each of the last 3 years that are on the terror known watch list. This doesn't include the people that we have not caught. So this is the existential threat, and this is the biggest threat. So I'm disappointed yet again that in this hearing, an annual threat assessment, that we are not talking about the open border policies. Mr. Haines mentioned earlier a Lincoln quote, which has evolved over the last couple of centuries, but I'll summarize it as, if we falter and lose our freedoms as a nation, it is because we destroyed them ourselves from within. This is a policy that is the direct result of a president who sits in the White House, who has intentionally opened our southern border, has created a migration challenge, as he puts it, that is resulting in 75,000 Americans dying of fentanyl poisonings each year, dozens of people being murdered at the hands of illegals, and now a cumulative 7 million people who are in our country who are unaccounted for, who have court dates in some cases in the 2032 time frame. We have no idea where they're living. They're victims of human smuggling. They're victims of effectively slavery within our own borders, working off their debt to the cartels. And so my question to you is, why have you failed to impart on this president the level of threat from a national security perspective that his policies are creating? And is this not being briefed? If it's being briefed, what is the reaction that you're getting from either the Secretary of Defense, Austin, Secretary of Homeland Defense, Mayorkas, or the President of the United States? I guess, Director Haines, we could start with you, and if anyone else has any interest in addressing this. Why has the President not recognized that the southern border policies that he has created, a very man-made problem, are themselves the biggest threat to our nation's security?
Thank you, Representative Garcia. I think the question, as I understand it for me, is are we providing to the policy community information about what's happening at the border? And I think, you know, as you indicate, we have our assessment in the annual threat assessment, the challenges and why it is that we're seeing so many folks at the border, and we do provide that information on a regular basis.
So that actually wasn't my question. My question is why has the President, in your opinion, not taken this on board? The fact that in 2022 there were 98 encounters with known terrorists on the terror watch list. In 2023, 172. These numbers are parabolic. They are exponential in nature. Why is this administration not listening to you? Do you lack the ability to communicate this clearly through the chain of command? Is there someone preventing you from clearly conveying this data set to the President? Or is there, frankly, just a President and his cabinet who don't give a damn about the southern border and the policies and the repercussions thereof?
I mean, in my experience, the policy community cares deeply about the national security of this country, and I think they are doing what they think is best. I would not hesitate, you know, or I would hesitate to suggest that I can provide an opinion about what the President thinks on these issues or why he's come to the conclusions he has.
I think the results speak for themselves, and I have no doubt that the agents in the field, the Border Patrol agents, the CIA, FBI agents in the field, care deeply about our nation's security. They are just as scared as we are, and that's what scares me, frankly, when you have a commander-in-chief who doesn't change his behavior patterns or his policies as a result of this invasion on our southern border and puts it last above all things is very concerning as an American citizen. I thank you for your time and your testimony and look forward to deeper dives on the classified side. I now recognize Ms. Houlihan for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to sit in public with you all, and I am grateful for the chance to talk about what is mentioned once on page 32, which is biology. Biology, it keeps me up at night in different ways than you probably would think. Biosecurity, bioterrorism, synthetic biology, biotech, you name it, bioweapons, which is what is named on page 32. It's definitely on the U.S. list of critical technologies, but I haven't heard enough conversation from ourselves as policymakers or from intel officers as well, who talk about biology with the same sense of urgency as we do about AI or we do about quantum, as an example. Biotech has enormous upsides and some really scary downsides as well, and our competitors see that as well. So I was wondering, since we know that China is indeed trying to catch up to us in this area, if you all, in this open setting, I recognize it's a little bit more difficult, could talk about two things. What is it that you see as the threat to the degree that you're able to, and also what are we doing and what can Congress do to help you prepare in terms of workforce? In terms of making sure that we have the proper lineup and authorities to be able to address the opportunities and the challenges and threats that biology has. And I'll start with Director Haines, please.
Thank you very much for raising this, and I share your concern about this issue. I think this is a fundamental question, and it's one that we've spent a lot of time trying to invest more resources in, particularly because, to your second point, on the workforce point, it is not an area where we're likely to grow the greatest expertise within the IC that's going to reside effectively outside of the intelligence community, and yet it's absolutely fundamental that we have access to that expertise, that we're bringing it into the community as we do. And in part, what we've been trying to encourage is sort of opportunities for exchanges where folks are able to actually work in tech areas and come back into the IC. We've also been working to try to expand our communication and our access to expertise in the private sector through advisory groups, through fellowships, through other types of mechanisms, and I'm sure others will talk about it. I know Director Burns has some in these areas as well. But, and then to your first point, I mean, I think the threat issue is, you know, in many respects, one of the challenges here is that biotech is almost by its nature dual use. In other words, the advances there are ones that are often going to be providing great opportunities for society and at the same time can create some challenges, not the least of which are in the context of bioweapons. And so really sort of being able to understand the dual use nature, then be able to find what is sort of the greatest priority from a national security perspective and lift that up for policymakers and do that in a way that doesn't hamper the science that is ultimately, hopefully going to serve to produce opportunities, but at the same time protect our national security in these spaces. So I maybe just leave it at that and leave it to others.
No, all I would add is just what Director Haines just mentioned, which is that as you described, you know, biotechnology offers both enormous promise and enormously troubling trend lines as well. We see our adversaries looking at ways in which they can invest in those troubling trend lines, whether it's in terms of the use of infectious diseases and pathogens, or, you know, the whole idea of you know, building super soldiers in the future using biotechnology. All of those are deeply worrisome. What are we doing about it? You know, we set up a new mission center that just celebrated its 2nd anniversary on transnational and technology issues, which has as one of its highest priorities biotechnology. We've increased hiring so that we have a dedicated unit of officers who can help us and then help policymakers better understand the nature of the threats and better anticipate and better disrupt them too.
General?
And just very briefly on the military intelligence side, we do have a small emerging and disruptive technology team. They have traditionally focused on AI and quantum, but increasingly over the last couple of years have had to focus on biotechnology. For us, that often means human performance, human-machine teaming, and more recently biosecurity. But as D&I Haines has laid out, I think for us it's about a capacity and a level of expertise that requires a partnering with industry, academia, medical communities, and with our fellow IC members that we will just have to strengthen and resource.
And Director Wray?
I would just add that from our end,
Ms. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I have a lot of questions I want to get through quickly. Director Haines, in September, your staff notified the committee that NCTC was hosting a 90-day effort called the Interagency Sprint Cell on Intelligence Support to Counter Narcotics, focused on identifying opportunities for improved intelligence-driven operational outcomes. Just wondering what the outcome was of that, I guess a pilot program, would you call it?
Yeah, it was really, it was a sprint that we hosted that brought in folks from across the intelligence community, meaning the folks here had folks who were representative on it, but also included, for example, parts of DHS that are not in their intelligence component, other folks, for example, in Treasury and so on. And the idea was really to see, are there ways in which we can better support within the intelligence community what DEA is doing, what Treasury is doing in sanctions, what...
So do you have recommendations based on that experience?
So they've just finalized a report. We can get you a copy of that and provide it.
I look forward to seeing it. General Haugh, how is NSA currently utilizing FISA 702 collection to target narcotics trafficking? And I really want you to focus on the fact that because counter-narcotics is not categorized within FISA 702, that prevents us from actually targeting a lot of the affiliates of the Mexican drug cartels, their subcontractors, let's say. Can you speak to that?
Representative Crenshaw, thank you for the question. Section 702 is vital to the national defense of our nation in so many different ways. As you've highlighted, it does give us a flexibility in terms of targeting foreign intelligence threats overseas. The area that we have been successful in this space is being able to identify some of the precursor chemicals as they are transiting from China. but then we do hit limitations in how we can use that authority. And that is an area that within the counter narcotics, giving us an opportunity to pursue additional authorities as it related to Section 702 and counter narcotics would give us more options to be able to further illuminate what that threat looks like coming to the United States.
Right, that's extremely important. We've tried to make we've tried to make those changes. We've run into problems, so it's important that the American people know that we're literally tying our hands behind our back in the effort to battle fentanyl production and trafficking. We're not even talking about American citizens here. We're talking about foreigners and foreign lands. Director Wray, I want to ask you, what is your view, especially from the law enforcement perspective, the FBI perspective? What are the costs and benefits of designating cartels as a foreign terrorist organization?
So from a law enforcement perspective, the principal benefit of a designation would be it would give us some enhanced abilities to go after their money that we don't have. We have some already. I don't want to make it sound like we don't have any, but it would enhance that. I think the principal effects of an FTO designation would be more in the lane of other agencies, authorities that they would have.
Okay. This is maybe a question for everybody, but the common question I have is who should be in charge of a whole of government strategy to battle the Mexican drug cartels? Is this a law enforcement problem, or is this our national security apparatus problem, or a mix of both? And if you could have your way, if you could pick somebody to be the grand strategist, where would they live? What office? Would it be the White House? Would it be the Attorney General's office? Would it be the DOD or CIA? What are your opinions on that? And I leave that to anyone, I suppose.
I think it's obviously, in a sense, beyond our scope, but what I would say is that I think my sense of it is that it is a kind of it needs to be a whole of government strategy, meaning that you're effectively moving forward on prosecutions, which DEA obviously spends the bulk of their time on, going after cartels and their networks. It is also an effort by Treasury and others to do sanctions. There is also an effort by DHS, obviously, to interdict, and they have had success in this space as well. It is also an opportunity for us to support that kind of broader interdiction through the intelligence that we provide. And I think it's all of those should be tools that we're using in this context.
I understand it caught you off guard a little bit there, but this is a longer conversation that we must have. And I have one more really important question, so I want to get to it. Our adversaries have no problem, they have no hesitation infiltrating our critical infrastructure through cyber means. They have no problem doing it, attacking civilian critical infrastructure. We do not have the policy or will to do the same back. I view this as a deterrence problem. It is the same to me as nuclear deterrence. Do you view it the same, and should we view cyber threats the same as we view nuclear deterrence and have the policies in place and the abilities to engage in the same kind of offensive cyber operations that our adversaries are perfectly willing to do?
So, Representative Crenshaw, I think this is an area for us, as we look at it, first and foremost, we look at it through 3 different lenses. First, it's our job to really understand and generate insights about the threat. And I think that's an area that we work across the community to understand what this threat looks like. Second is enabling defense. How do we enable defense from both internal to the government, also for our industry and for our allies in these type of threats? And the third is we have to impose cost. And that can be through any number of means, using all the tools that are available to the executive branch to impose costs on anyone that are willing to target our critical infrastructure. And we have to be able to inform that.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. We need to be able to impose costs, and our enemy has to know that we're willing to impose costs, which is effectively the philosophy of deterrence. But I'm well over time, so thank you, Chairman, for indulging me, and I yield back.
Ms. Bamberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up on some of the recent questions from my colleagues related to the border, related to the fentanyl crisis. I think we heard you loud and clear about the importance of 702 and our ability to understand and attempt to disrupt some of the fentanyl-related networks. I appreciate that in the public version of the Worldwide Threats, it talks explicitly about transnational criminal organizations, their threat to U.S. And our public health systems, our financial systems, and the safety and security of the United States. Director Haines, I also heard you loud and clear in your response to my colleague's question saying that the information you're giving to the policy community, I would just assert that we are the policy community, and it is also up to us here in Congress to legislate and put forth bills that will keep, as you note on page 36, the more than 100,000 annual drug deaths in the United States that are attributed to illicit fentanyl, mostly supplied by Mexican-based TCOs, even as U.S. law enforcement seized record amounts of illicit fentanyl precursor chemicals and pill pressing equipment. And China, as it states here, remains a primary source for illicit fentanyl precursor chemicals. This is a global issue. This is an issue that gets at the heart of our national security overseas and abroad. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on this because we are the policy community that should be solving it. There was a bill in the Senate that was proposed, didn't move forward, and we can discuss that at a later date. Now I want to move with my actual questions related to terrorism issues. Specifically, recently, my colleague Congresswoman Houlihan and I spent time in Djibouti, in Nairobi, and in Somalia, focused on the al-Shabaab threat and the threat of terrorism as it continues in Africa specifically, but the larger impact. We've seen incidents of mass kidnapping of nearly 300 school-age children and women in northern Nigeria, likely perpetrated by Islamist extremists. Al-Shabaab in Somalia is the best funded and most capable al-Qaeda affiliate. Last year, ISIS-aligned militants in Uganda staged a series of attacks to include a massacre at a boarding school and the murder of a British couple on a honeymoon safari. And Africa continues to be the only continent where ISIS affiliates are growing. My sincere gratitude to every person on the ground, both military personnel and intelligence community personnel who are working in this fight. But can you please update the committee on your efforts to combat and contain terrorism emanating from Africa and what threat Africa-based extremist groups pose to the U.S. and our allied interests, either in direct attacks or, as was a topic of conversation during our time in East Africa, money funneling out from al-Shabaab to aid other affiliated organizations. And I'll open it up to whomever would like to take it.
All right, I will start, but I'll be quick. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Africa is a growing space for terrorism. I mean, and while ISIS and al-Qaeda, which we spend a lot of time on, remain intent on attacking the United States and U.S. interests, but they're more capable of striking, essentially, U.S. interests in the regions where they operate, and that is true whether it's in Africa or in the Middle East and other spaces, rather than in the homeland, following sort of the years of, frankly, sustained pressure that we've engaged in on those issues. And, but this is part of what is creating the sort of environment that you describe, which is also fueling instability and ultimately exacerbating many of the challenges that Africa already faces, particularly in the sub-Sahel region, and is managing. And so we have done a lot, and I'll hand it over to others to talk about some of the things that we're working on in these areas.
I couldn't agree with you more on the significance, not just in the Sahel, as we were discussing earlier, but in East Africa. I was in Mogadishu and Nairobi not long after you were there, and first, I have huge admiration for the work that all sorts of U.S. officials are doing right now. I think you're right to underscore the threat posed by al-Shabaab coming out of Somalia, not just in Somalia, but more broadly, because they're flush with money, and some of that money is moving out. I would emphasize, finally, the importance of our partnerships. I think the Kenyans have proven to be a very effective partner on a lot of these issues, and we can talk in closed session about some of the things that we're trying to strengthen, not just in that partnership, but in other ones as well, because I think in Africa, that sense of partnership is going to be incredibly important in dealing with what is a growing terrorist threat.
With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Haynes, Special Counsel Haugh is here on the Hill today. He has put into his report that President Biden has top secret compartmented documents knowingly in his basement. He knowingly provided those documents to his author. Have you seen those documents?
I have seen, I think, all of the documents that were part of the special counsel's.
There were several boxes worth. Have you
And,
seen all of them, part of them?
I've seen all of them, but I wouldn't say that I've read through all of them. They went through a classification review that we did within the intelligence community.
Will you provide that review to this committee, this damage assessment to this committee? Will you commit to that?
I think we did an overall damage assessment with respect to all of the different formers, documents, et cetera, and that's been provided to the Hill to, I think, the Gang of Eight, and we'll see whether or not we can provide any further.
Who has possession of those documents now?
Department of Justice.
Okay, great. I would look forward to, Mr. Chairman, the broader committee seeing the extent of these documents. I mean, they could have been fairly benign, or they could have been incredibly serious. So I would encourage the intelligence community to brief the committee on the extent of the damage of those documents that apparently have been sitting for quite some time, both in the University of Pennsylvania Center and in his house, from his time as a Senate Vice President and perhaps now as President. Thank you. Switching to Afghanistan. The UN is reporting that al-Qaeda has established 8 new training camps in Afghanistan and lists the specific provinces where al-Qaeda currently has training camps, including a new base to stockpile weaponry in the Panjshir. Yet, the threat assessment says al-Qaeda is basically not much of a threat. Do you disagree with the UN Security Council's assessment, Ms. Haines?
Can we approach this in closed session, please?
I would look forward to that. Would you say that at this point, al-Qaeda is more or less of a threat than 2020? Does al-Qaeda still intend to attack the homeland and Western interest if given the opportunity?
We think they continue to have the intent, but not the capacity.
Will they grow that capacity if given the opportunity?
Sure.
And the UN seems to think they are growing that capacity, so I'll look forward to whether you agree or disagree with that assessment. Switching to Russia. Russia is still selling an incredible amount of oil through India, through brokers in China. I think it's safe to say that Russia benefits when the price of oil is high, correct? Does anyone disagree? This is how primarily Russia is fueling its war machine in Ukraine and its ambitions elsewhere. Do we agree?
That's true.
So it is, I think you'd also agree, less oil and gas on the international market drives the price high, and therefore both Putin and Tehran, for that matter, have their war coffers full. Does anyone disagree with that? So it's safe to say then that an LNG ban on exporting American, cleaner, by the way, and more plentiful gas is indirectly fueling Putin's war machine. Does anyone disagree with that? I'll take that as a no, and in fact, I'll just share with the witnesses, I just sat down with the Speaker of the Parliament from Lithuania, right on the front lines of Russian aggression. She said, we buy 85% of our gas from those terminals in Texas and Louisiana. And at some point soon, they're gonna have to go back to buying Russian gas. So we are literally, our domestic energy policy is creating dependencies and fueling Russia's war machine that then we're being asked to spend against by also continuing to support Ukraine. And we absolutely should stop Putin, but we have to examine our own policies and what that's doing for both Tehran and for Moscow, yet in the assessment, there's nothing on energy policy. In terms of Gaza, is Hamas an honest actor? I mean, do they tell the truth on a habitual basis? Is anyone?
No.
Okay, so we have a casualty figure coming from the Hamas-run health ministry that is continually reported. I don't think if Putin was talking about a Russian-run health ministry and their casualties, we would take that as face value. Does the intelligence community take the 30,000 figure at face value, or do you have some independent verification there?
We don't take it on face value, but it is, I would just indicate it's actually not that far off from what the IDF assessment is.
Okay, so, but it is not accurate on the face of it, as you just said. You don't take that as face value.
We just don't take it on face value.
Okay, thank you. And neither should the president in both the State of the Union and national television. Then finally, Mr. Wray, on domestic terrorism, we have 16 universities teaching as part of their curriculum a book, How to Bomb Oil Pipelines. 16 universities. I would consider that facilitating domestic terrorism, would you?
Well, I don't know whether there would be
I'd like to enter in the record,
but yeah.
Yeah, I would like to enter in the record reporting how to, let's see, universities are teaching students to blow up oil pipelines with a book in their curriculum, How to Bomb Oil Pipelines. I think you would agree that that's unacceptable and could be considered domestic terrorism.
Totally unacceptable.
Mr. Wray, can I just get your commitment to look into what I would call absolutely unacceptable left-wing domestic terrorism, and not only what the activities, but who's funding it?
We will certainly look into all forms of terrorism and including funding.
Thank you. I'll look for that briefing. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gomez, who gets the Patience Award for having sat this entire time, not during your comments, I mean during the entire hearing, waiting to ask a question. Mr. Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Haines, Director Burns, General Haugh, Director Wray, and then General Kruse. I want to be clear that I have called for a ceasefire in order to free all the hostages held by Hamas, allow more humanitarian aid to enter Gaza to relieve suffering, especially of the children, and hopefully begin to set the stage for a two-state solution, for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state living in peace next to a secure Israel. Additionally, Hamas must not have any role in a future Palestinian state, especially after the October 7th attack, where they committed atrocities, killing, raping, and kidnapping innocent civilians. I also recognize that the Hamas leader, Sinwar, is not starving or suffering and is using hostages as a way to protect himself, and that this could end if he just turned himself in. But we know that won't happen. Mr. Director Burns, you recently returned from yet another visit to the Middle East to assist in negotiating a ceasefire which will release additional hostages held by Hamas while increasing the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Can you provide an update on how close we are to such a deal?
I think there's still the possibility of such a deal, and as I said, it won't be for lack of trying on our part, working very closely with our Israeli, Qatari, and Egyptian counterparts. This is a very tough process. I don't think anyone can guarantee success. The only thing I think you can guarantee is that the alternatives are worse. They're worse for innocent civilians who are suffering in Gaza. They're worse for the hostages and their families, and I think they're worse for all of us. So, we'll continue to work very hard on this. As I said, as the president has said, I think there's still a possibility. And as long as there's the smallest possibility, I think it's essential for all of us to do everything we can.
What are the major obstacles to achieving a ceasefire?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of very complicated issues in this negotiation. I don't want to go into all of them in open session. I'd be glad to in closed session as well. But, as I said, I think it's still possible to make progress. But there are a number of, very complicated issues that have to be sorted through. But it's not impossible, and I think it is absolutely urgent.
And I appreciate that Director Haynes mentioned that you don't take any numbers at face value. Neither would I. Does the IC have a reliable assessment of the number of civilian casualties in Gaza as well as the humanitarian toll?
Thanks. So we really do not have our own collection to be able to tell you with real confidence what the numbers are. What we look to is, as was indicated, what is out there, the Gaza Health Ministry reports. We also talk to and largely rely on our Israeli counterparts, and the numbers are not that different. I think around the time of these estimates, it was 30,000 or roughly 31, I think was closer to it. The IDF was actually reporting about 28 or something like that. So it is considerable. And the challenge, of course, is that the Health Ministry is not differentiating between civilians and fighters in that context. So you're looking at a broad range of folks. And again, very challenging for us to independently corroborate effectively what the numbers are on these things.
Additionally, one issue that was mentioned a few weeks ago, that there was a concern about escalating tensions in absence of a ceasefire once Ramadan started, particularly in the West Bank. Is that a significant concern for the IC?
It is. I think the West Bank remains a pretty combustible place right now for a whole variety of reasons. And I think the risks of a spillover of increased violence in the West Bank and places like Jordan and elsewhere in the region are also considerable. So it's in everybody's interest to try to get to the kind of ceasefire hostage deal that we were discussing before, because I think that is the best way in many respects to calm the situation in the West Bank and also elsewhere in the region too, because you've got Iranian proxies from Lebanese Hezbollah to the Shia militia groups in Iraq to the Houthis in Yemen, who are in a sense feeding off of this crisis and this conflict. And our experience in the last ceasefire and hostage release that took place in the latter part of November was that all of those groups observed the ceasefire that resulted, and that would certainly be our hope in this case.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is such an important opportunity for the American people to get a view of the leadership of our intelligence community as you assess worldwide threats, and to have views expressed from both Republicans and Democrats about those threats. And when you think about worldwide threats, whether it's from space or from another country, from a terror group, of course they are the ones that are most important, that affect American people in their daily lives, in their daily communities. And so you've heard a lot today, I think, from starting with Chairman Turner and Mr. Garcia, Mr. Kelly, and others about the threats being encountered along our border. And those are people on the terror watch list who've crossed the border and are in the United States that we have encountered, and therefore we know they're in the United States, or we have asked them to leave the United States. And so we don't have any idea of how many people have crossed the border with this chaos of 7 million encounters that have distracted our CBP uniformed people along that border. So I want to start with following up on their thoughts. And ICE has reported that a member of Al-Shabaab, who was on the terror watch list, entered the United States and, quote, according to the director when he testified in January, quote, roamed around the country for a year, close quote, and wasn't really apprehended or known about until he used his real identity documents to try to get a job. So, Director Wray, to draw this main issue that we have on this committee from an oversight point of view is, whether it's 169 people in this fiscal year or 300 in the last 3 fiscal years, where are the people that are on the terror watch list? You were asked about have they flown on a domestic flight, but is this a priority for FBI, domestic counterterrorism, counterintelligence operations, that these people are targets if they've been encountered at the border?
So let me answer it this way. Certainly all of our joint terrorism task forces, we have joint terrorism task forces in all 56 field offices, have as a significant part of their work focusing on terrorist subjects of investigations, many of whom may be people who, in fact, all of whom, if we've got an open investigation, would be on the watch list.
Yeah, let me stop you there. So this triggering for that 56 field offices triggered by an open investigation. So here's my question. We had the Counterintelligence Fusion Center testify before us recently, and I'm interested in the data integration, that if they see, if TSA or CBP encounters these people and they go into our database, is that automatically go to one of our SAICs that this person's now in the United States, even though there's not, quote, an open investigation? In other words, as a general information matter, are we fusing that information to our domestic counterterrorism, counterintelligence people? Someone is on the no-fly list or the terror watch list. They've been encountered. They've now taken a Southwest Airlines flight from Texas to Boston. Does the Boston SAIC know that? Are they notified of that?
The way the system works, they should be. I can't tell you that it's happened in every instance, but that's the way the system should work. I think the bigger concern, frankly, are individuals who, I would put them in two categories. One, someone who is on the list but presents fake documents, and because of the basis for which they're being on the list, there aren't biometrics, fingerprints or otherwise to match them against, and so nobody catches them. Or somebody who should have been on the list, but intelligence wasn't developed to say they should be on the list until after they're in.
Yeah, and in the case of the al-Shabaab roamer in the domestic 50 states, he presented fake documents to get in the country. But what concerned us in December alone, CBB's estimate of 300,000 encounters in that month alone on the border, they acknowledged at Eagle Pass when 60 members of Congress were there, that 6,000 people crossed the border one day and there were no documentation process. No biometrics, no photo, no interview, no run against the list, no checking of documents. They just passed them through into the U.S. So that's a small sample out of 7.1 million. But I think we're concerned on this committee that that data is not being shared effectively. And I would ask Director Haines, is it a legitimate question for me in my oversight capacity to ask you as our director, TSA, CBP, FBI, fusioning, coordinating, integrating the data of the people who you've heard about all morning who have crossed the border with fake documents or not, been encountered on the terror watch list, or were actually, but are not subject to an open investigation. Can I have your commitment that we can actually get an answer to our question? Because we wrote you and asked, what is what's the status of the 169 people that were encountered? And we've never gotten an answer. Like, here's person one, he was deported. Here's person two, presented fake documents, we picked him up in Boston. Fake person three, we picked him up in Chicago. We don't know. We actually don't know the answer to the question. It's a public, what happens not public, but that number, 169 people, the American people are saying, well, where are they? So we're just reflecting the common sense question. Where are they? May I have your commitment?
Absolutely. You can have my commitment to try to work to get you whatever information you're looking for, and we'll talk about whatever the letter is that you've sent and see if we can get you an answer.
Thank you very much. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We have no other members in the queue. So before we close, I just want to offer if there's anything anyone wants to add in closing comments or in clarification of a comment that they've made earlier. Any thoughts? Seeing none, we'll be adjourned till 2:15. Thank you so much.